in the shadowed corridors of the Hofburg Palace, where marble whispers secrets of centuries past, a young man's footsteps echo against the weight of destiny. Here, beneath gilded ceilings that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, time moves like honey through crystal chandeliers, each drop catching the light of 1,000 stories yet untold. The scent of aged oak and old leather mingles with the distant sound of Vienna's church bells, their bronze voices calling across cobblestone streets where history walks hand in hand with dreams. In these halls, where power sleeps in chambers and awakens in the rustle of imperial robes, a crown waits heavy with the dreams of nations, warm with the breath of generations. This is where a boy becomes an emperor, where innocence meets the terrible beauty of absolute power, and where the Habsburg double eagle spreads its wings across the map of Europe, like a shadow cast by the setting sun. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. On the 18th day of August in the year 1830, as summer's warmth still lingered in the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, a child was born who would one day rule over 50 million souls across the sprawling Austrian Empire. Franz Joseph Karl, named for his great-uncle Emperor Franz and his grandfather Archduke Joseph, entered the world not as heir apparent, but as the eldest son of Archduke Franz Karl, younger brother to the childless Emperor Ferdinand I. The infant's first cries echoed through the Baroque chambers of the palace, those same rooms where Mozart had once played for Empress Maria Theresa, where Napoleon had slept during his occupation of Vienna, where the Congress of Vienna had redrawn the map of Europe. The weight of history pressed down upon the child's cradle like morning mist settling upon the Danube, though none could yet imagine that this baby would one day preside over the empire's greatest triumphs and its most profound transformations. Franz Joseph's mother, Archduchess Sophie of Bavaria, was a woman of remarkable intelligence and unwavering determination. Born Princess Sophie Friedrich Dorothea Wilhelmine of Bavaria, she had arrived at the Austrian court with the sharp political instincts of the Wittelsbach dynasty flowing through her veins. The court whispered that she possessed the ambition her mild-mannered husband lacked, that behind her gentle smile lay the calculating mind of a true Habsburg empress. She would prove them right. The young Archduke's childhood unfolded within the formal rhythms of court life, where every day was choreographed by tradition and every moment served the greater glory of the dynasty. His first steps were taken across floors where emperors had walked for centuries, his first words spoken in rooms where treaties had been signed and kingdoms divided. From his earliest years, Franz Joseph was shaped by the peculiar mixture of intimacy and grandeur that defined Habsburg family life, where a child might play with toy soldiers in the morning and attend a formal court ceremony in the afternoon. The education of an imperial prince began almost from birth. While other children learned their letters, Franz Joseph learned the intricate genealogies of European royalty, memorizing the complex web of marriages, alliances, and rivalries that bound the continent's ruling families together. His tutors, carefully selected by his mother, included some of the finest minds of the Austrian Empire. Count Heinrich Bombels, a refined diplomat who taught him the art of statecraft. General Count Franz Folliot de Crenneville, who instructed him in military matters, and Father Joseph Othmar Rauscher, later Archbishop of Vienna, who guided his spiritual development. The boy's days followed a rigid schedule that would have exhausted most adults. He rose at dawn, attended Mass in the palace chapel, then proceeded 2 hours of instruction in languages, mathematics, history, and geography. By age 10, he could converse fluently in German, Hungarian, Czech, and Italian, the languages of his future subjects. His afternoons were devoted to physical training, riding, fencing, and military exercises that would prepare him for his eventual role as supreme commander of the imperial armies. Yet perhaps the most important aspect of Franz Joseph's education was invisible, woven into the very fabric of his daily existence. He learned to suppress his own desires in service of duty, to present an impassive façade regardless of his inner feelings, to view himself not as an individual but as the living embodiment of the Habsburg legacy. This emotional discipline, instilled from childhood, would later define his reign and contribute to both his strengths and his tragedies as emperor. The Austria of Franz Joseph's youth was a realm of stunning contradictions. The empire stretched from the snowy peaks of the Alps to the sun-baked plains of Hungary, from the bustling streets of Vienna to the remote villages of Galicia. It encompassed Germans and Hungarians, Czechs and Poles, Italians and Croats, Romanians and Serbs, a tapestry of languages, cultures, and religions, held together by the golden thread of Habsburg rule. In the capital Vienna, the waltz was being born in the ballrooms of the nobility, while Schubert composed his immortal songs in modest apartments across the city. This was the age of Metternich, when the Austrian foreign minister's conservative system sought to preserve the old order against the revolutionary ideas that had swept across Europe in the wake of the French Revolution. The young Franz Joseph absorbed these lessons in stability and tradition, learning to view change with suspicion and to prize order above all else. He would carry these convictions with him throughout his long reign, sometimes to his empire's benefit, sometimes to its detriment. As the 1840s dawned, the political landscape of Europe began to shift beneath the feet of the old order. The forces of nationalism and liberalism, long suppressed by Metternich's system, stirred restlessly across the continent. In the German states, intellectuals dreamed of unification. In Hungary, Magyar nobles demanded greater autonomy. In Italy, the movement sought to drive out foreign rulers and create a unified nation. The young Franz Joseph, now entering his teenage years, watched these developments with the cool detachment his tutors had taught him, not yet understanding that these distant rumblings would soon shake the very foundations of his world. The first hint of the coming storm arrived in 1846, when a bloody peasant uprising in Galicia shocked the Austrian court. The rebellion, sparked by desperate poverty and ethnic tensions, was eventually suppressed, but it served as a warning of the volatile forces bubbling beneath the surface of the empire. Franz Joseph, then 16, observed his elder's response with careful attention, filing away lessons about the delicate balance between firmness and flexibility that would govern his future decisions. In the privacy of his chambers, the young Archduke began to grapple with the weight of his destiny. Though he was not yet heir to the throne, his uncle Ferdinand remained emperor, and his father, Franz Karl, stood ahead of him in the line of succession court observers, had begun to speculate about the possibility of his eventual accession. Ferdinand's mental incapacity made him unsuitable for the demanding role of emperor, while Franz Karl's gentle nature seemed ill-suited to the challenges facing the monarchy. Archduchess Sophie, ever mindful of her son's future, had begun to position him as the dynasty's hope for renewal. She arranged for him to attend more court functions, to meet with foreign dignitaries, and to observe the machinery of government in action. The teenager who had once played with toy soldiers now stood silently in the background of state ceremonies, his keen eyes absorbing every detail of imperial protocol and political maneuvering. The year 1848 arrived like a thunderclap across the peaceful world of the Austrian court. In February, revolution erupted in Paris, toppling King Louis-Philippe and establishing the Second Republic. The news spread across Europe with the speed of wildfire, igniting long-suppressed hopes and fears. In every capital, in Vienna, the initial reaction was one of cautious optimism. Surely the revolutionary madness would not cross the Rhine. Surely the Habsburg Empire's subjects remained loyal to their ancient dynasty. How wrong they were. On March 13, 1848, as spring snow still dusted the rooftops of Vienna, crowds gathered in the streets demanding constitutional government and the dismissal of Prince Metternich, the man who had dominated European politics for a generation, who had built his career on the suppression of revolutionary movements, now found himself the target of his own subjects' anger. The crowds grew larger and more militant as the day wore on, their chants echoing off the Baroque façades of the inner city. Inside the Hofburg Palace, the imperial family gathered in emergency session. Emperor Ferdinand, bewildered by the chaos outside his windows, could offer no guidance. The decision fell to Archduke Franz Karl and his advisors, with Archduchess Sophie's voice carrying unusual weight in the council chamber, as the sound of breaking glass and angry voices drifted through the palace walls. The fate of the monarchy hung in the balance. The 17-year-old Franz Joseph watched these events unfold with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Here was history in the making, the old order challenged by forces that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the city. He observed his elders' uncertainty, their heated debates about whether to use force against the demonstrators or to make concessions to their demands. These moments would shape his understanding of power and its limits, teaching him lessons that would influence his decisions for decades to come. By evening, the inevitable had occurred. Prince Metternich, the architect of European conservatism, submitted his resignation and fled Vienna in disguise. The crowds celebrated in the streets, singing revolutionary songs and waving improvised banners. The old order, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, had crumbled in a single day. The 17-year-old Archduke, who had never known a world without Metternich's guiding hand, now faced an uncertain future in a realm where the very foundations of authority were being questioned. The revolution in Vienna was only the beginning. Across the empire, long-suppressed nationalisms exploded into open rebellion. In Hungary, the charismatic Lajos Kossuth led a movement for independence that would soon transform into a full-scale war. In the Italian territories, revolts broke out in Milan and Venice, with insurgents proclaiming the end of Austrian rule. In Prague, Czech nationalists demanded autonomy within a federated empire. From every corner of the Habsburg dominions came word of uprisings, demonstrations, and declarations of independence. The imperial court, accustomed to the stately rhythms of palace life, found itself overwhelmed by the rapid succession of crises. Emperor Ferdinand, never robust mentally, became increasingly unable to function under the pressure. His ministers, trained in the careful diplomatic arts of the old regime, struggled to respond to the revolutionary chaos. It became clear that extraordinary measures would be needed to preserve the dynasty and the empire. In the councils of the Habsburg family, Archduchess Sophie's voice grew stronger with each passing day. She had never doubted her son's destiny, but now she saw an opportunity to accelerate his path to the throne. Franz Karl, her husband, had always been content to remain in the background, more interested in his art collection than in affairs of state. Sophie began to speak openly of the need for a younger, more energetic leader, someone who could embody the monarchy's renewal and restoration. Franz Joseph himself remained largely silent during these family deliberations, but his presence spoke volumes. At 18, he possessed a dignity and composure that belied his years. His military training had given him an erect bearing and an air of command that impressed even skeptical courtiers. His education had prepared him for this moment, though none could have anticipated it would come so soon or under such dramatic circumstances. The summer of 1848 brought military disaster to the Austrian cause. In Italy, the aged Field Marshal Radetzky found himself surrounded by hostile populations and facing the combined forces of Piedmont and the revolutionary governments. In Hungary, the imperial armies suffered a series of defeats at the hands of Magyar insurgents. Even in Vienna, the imperial government's authority remained tenuous, dependent on the goodwill of a population that had already demonstrated its capacity for rebellion. It was during this crisis that Franz Joseph first tasted the bitter responsibility of command. Sent to accompany the imperial armies in Italy, he witnessed firsthand the chaos and confusion that had engulfed his family's ancient domains. The young Archduke, who had studied military strategy in the comfortable classrooms of the Hofburg, now found himself amid the smoke and carnage of actual battle. He saw Austrian soldiers retreating in disorder, heard the triumphant shouts of Italian revolutionaries, and felt the weight of impending defeat pressing down upon his shoulders. Yet, in these dark moments, something extraordinary occurred. Young man who had been raised in the artificial atmosphere of court life discovered reserves of strength and determination that surprised even his closest advisors. He displayed a calm courage under fire that won the respect of veteran officers, a quick grasp of tactical situations that impressed his military tutors, and an unshakable faith in the ultimate triumph of Habsburg arms that helped steady the. He learned to sleep in army tents, to eat soldiers' rations, to endure the hardships of campaign life without complaint. The importance of maintaining discipline under pressure, the delicate balance between firmness and flexibility that marked effective leadership. These lessons would serve him well in the trials that lay ahead. As autumn arrived, the situation in Vienna deteriorated further. A second revolution in October saw the imperial court flee to Olmütz, leaving the capital in the hands of radical Democrats and Hungarian sympathizers. The humiliation of this retreat burned deeply in Franz Joseph's memory, reinforcing his conviction that compromise with revolution was impossible. From Omets, the imperial government began to plan its counteroffensive, marshalling loyal troops from across the empire for a final assault on the rebellious capital. The recapture of Vienna in November 1848 marked a turning point in the revolutionary crisis. Laid siege to the city with methodical precision. The bombardment of Vienna, with its Baroque churches and elegant palaces, shocked Europe and demonstrated the Habsburg dynasty's determination to preserve its authority at any cost. Franz Joseph, now 18 and increasingly involved in military planning, watched these events with grim satisfaction. The lesson was clear. Force, when properly applied, could restore order to a chaotic world. The winter of 1848 brought a strange quiet to the Austrian Empire. Like the stillness that follows a thunderstorm, Vienna lay subdued under military occupation, its revolutionary fires extinguished by Windisch-Gretz's artillery. Yet across the empire, the flames of rebellion continued to burn. In Hungary, Kossuth's government had declared complete independence, creating a rival state that threatened to tear the heart out of the Habsburg domains. In northern Italy, the situation remained precarious, with Field Marshal Radetzky's forces holding only a few fortress cities, while revolutionary governments controlled the countryside. Within the imperial court, now returned to Vienna under the protection of loyal bayonets, the question of succession had become unavoidable. Emperor Ferdinand, never mentally robust, had been completely overwhelmed by the revolutionary crisis. His inability to function as an effective ruler had become a liability that threatened the very survival of the monarchy. Behind closed doors, the Habsburg family council debated the unprecedented step of forced abdication. Archduchess Sophie, her maternal instincts now fully aligned with dynastic necessity, pressed relentlessly for her son's advancement. She had spent months cultivating relationships with key military commanders and conservative politicians, building a coalition of support for Franz Joseph's eventual accession. Her husband, Archduke Franz Karl, remained the legal heir, but Sophie had convinced him that his own gentle nature made him unsuitable for the harsh realities of imperial rule in a revolutionary age. The young Archduke himself maintained his characteristic reserve during these family deliberations, but those who knew him well detected signs of the enormous pressure he was under. At 18, he was being asked to assume responsibilities that had challenged men twice his age. The weight of 50 million subjects, the burden of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries, the challenge of preserving an empire that seemed to be dissolving before his eyes. All of this would fall upon his shoulders if the family council's plans came to fruition. As December 1848 approached, the momentum toward abdication became irresistible. The military situation demanded decisive leadership. The political crisis required a fresh face to embody the monarchy's renewal, and the dynastic imperative called for a young emperor who could potentially reign for decades. On December 2nd, in the Archbishop's palace at Olmütz, the formal ceremony of abdication took place in an atmosphere of solemn gravity. Emperor Ferdinand, dressed in the ancient robes of state, spoke the words that would echo through the centuries: "I renounce all participation in the government of the state. I transfer my rights to my nephew, Francis Joseph." The elderly monarch, his voice trembling with emotion, then turned to the young man who would succeed him. "Bear yourself bravely," he whispered. "God will protect you. It is done gladly." In that moment, the boy who had played with toy soldiers in the gardens of Schönbrunn became Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary and Bohemia, ruler of domains that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The 18-year-old emperor's first acts revealed the steel beneath his youthful exterior. Rather than seeking accommodation with the revolutionary forces that had shaken his empire, he immediately began planning their complete suppression. His advisors, many of them chosen by his mother, shared his conviction that only the complete restoration of imperial authority could preserve the monarchy. The new emperor's motto, Veribus Unitus, with united forces, reflected his determination to bind together the disparate peoples of his realm under Habsburg rule. The proclamation of Franz Joseph's accession sent shockwaves across Europe. Foreign observers, accustomed to the elderly and ineffective Ferdinand, now faced an unknown quantity in the young emperor. Some saw opportunity in his inexperience, hoping to extract concessions from a ruler who had not yet learned the arts of diplomacy. Others recognized in his bearing and early decisions the emergence of a formidable opponent who would not easily yield to pressure. The revolutionary governments across the empire reacted with predictable defiance. In Hungary, Kossuth's parliament refused to recognize the new emperor's authority, declaring that Ferdinand's abdication was invalid without their consent. In northern Italy, the Republican leaders dismissed the young Habsburg as a puppet of the old regime, predicting that his reign would be brief and inglorious. They would soon learn how gravely they had underestimated their new adversary. Franz Joseph's first priority was the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, which posed the most serious threat to the empire's integrity. The Magyar rebels had created a functioning government, raised substantial armies, and won a series of victories against imperial forces. Their success had inspired other nationalist movements across the empire and attracted sympathy from liberal governments in Western Europe. The young emperor understood that failure in Hungary would likely mean the end of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. The decision to request Russian assistance in suppressing the Hungarian revolt was perhaps the most controversial of Franz Joseph's early reign. Tsar Nicholas I, the self-appointed guardian of European conservatism, had already offered to help crush the revolutionary movements within the Austrian Empire. The proud young emperor, conscious of his family's ancient dignity, found the prospect of foreign intervention deeply humiliating. Yet the alternative, the potential loss of Hungary and the collapse of the monarchy, was even more unthinkable. The arrival of Russian armies in Hungary during the summer of 1849 marked the beginning of the end for the revolutionary cause. Combined forces of Austria and Russia, numbering over 300,000 men, slowly but inexorably crushed the Magyar resistance. The young emperor, now 19, followed the campaign with intense interest, learning valuable lessons about the relationship between military power and political authority. He observed how force, when applied systematically and without mercy, could restore order to the most chaotic situations. The final defeat of the Hungarian army at Temesvar in August 1849 was followed by a wave of executions that shocked liberal opinion across Europe. 13 Hungarian generals were hanged at Arad, their deaths serving as a grim reminder of the price of rebellion against Habsburg authority. Franz Joseph, though he did not personally order these executions, made no effort to prevent them. The young emperor had learned that mercy in victory could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness was a luxury he could not afford as the Hungarian Revolution collapsed. Franz Joseph turned his attention to the Italian territories, where Field Marshal Radetzky had been waging a patient campaign to restore Austrian control. The grizzled old soldier, now in his 80s, had become something of a father figure to the young emperor, teaching him the harsh realities of military command. Under Radetzky's tutelage, Franz Joseph learned to view war not as a glorious adventure, but as a necessary instrument of statecraft, to be employed with calculating precision and unwavering resolve. The victory at Novara in March 1849, where Austrian forces decisively defeated the Piedmontese army, marked the effective end of the first phase of the Italian revolutionary movement. The young emperor, present at the battle, watched as his armies shattered the hopes of Italian nationalists and restored Habsburg authority throughout Lombardy and Venetia. The sight of enemy soldiers fleeing in disorder, of revolutionary banners trampled in the mud, of his own troops advancing with disciplined precision, these images would remain with him for the rest of his life. By the end of 1849, Franz Joseph had achieved what many had thought impossible just 18 months earlier. The revolutions that had seemed to threaten the very existence of the Austrian Empire had been suppressed with methodical efficiency. The young emperor, who had ascended the throne amid chaos and uncertainty, had proven himself a leader of remarkable determination and strategic insight. He had learned to wield power with a combination of calculation and ruthlessness that would characterize his entire reign. Yet victory came at a price that would haunt the empire for generations. The brutal suppression of the Hungarian Revolution had created a legacy of resentment that would poison relations between Vienna and Budapest for decades. The executions at Arad had transformed defeated rebels into martyrs, their memory serving as a rallying cry for future nationalist movements. The young emperor, in his determination to preserve the old order, had sown the seeds of future conflicts that would ultimately prove even more dangerous than the revolutions he had defeated. The 19th century reached its midpoint. Franz Joseph stood at the pinnacle of his power. At 20, he ruled over an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from the Baltic to the Adriatic. His armies had crushed the revolutionary movements that had threatened to tear his realm apart. His authority, challenged so dramatically in 1848, had been restored with interest. The young emperor, who had inherited chaos, had created order, imposed discipline, and demonstrated that the Habsburg dynasty retained the strength to dominate Central Europe. But as Franz Joseph stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace, looking out over the subdued streets of Vienna, he could not know that his greatest triumphs lay behind him. The revolutions of 1848 had been suppressed, but the forces they had unleashed, nationalism, liberalism, the demand for popular sovereignty, would continue to work beneath the surface of European society. The young emperor, who had learned to rule through force, would discover that in the modern world, force alone was not enough to hold together a multinational empire. The seeds of future challenges had been planted in the very soil of his victories, waiting for the right conditions to grow into threats that would prove even more dangerous than the ones he had already faced. The weight of empire settled upon Franz Joseph's shoulders like winter snow upon the Alpine peaks, each responsibility adding to the burden that would never truly leave him. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Hofburg Palace lay wrapped in silence, the young emperor would walk the corridors his ancestors had paced, feeling the presence of centuries pressing against his consciousness. The revolution of 1848 had shaken the very foundations of Habsburg rule. And now, at 18, he stood as the guardian of an empire that stretched from the Italian Alps to the Carpathian Mountains, from the shores of the Adriatic to the forests of Galicia. The morning light that filtered through the palace windows illuminated a face already marked by the gravity of his position. Franz Joseph's features, still bearing the softness of youth, had begun to set into the stern lines that would define his public persona for the next 68 years. His blue eyes, inherited from his mother, held a depth that spoke of sleepless nights spent studying maps and dispatches, of decisions that would affect millions of lives across the vast expanse of his domains. The first great challenge to his authority came not from foreign enemies, but from within his own borders. In the Hungarian plains, where the Danube carved its ancient path through fertile soil, the spirit of revolution still burned in the hearts of Magyar nobles and common folk alike. Lajos Kossuth, the fiery orator whose words had ignited the Hungarian independence movement, had fled to exile, but the dream of autonomy lived on in the villages and towns where Hungarian was spoken with fierce pride. Franz Joseph's approach to governance in these early years was shaped by the austere discipline that had been drilled into him since childhood. His daily routine began before sunrise, with prayers in the palace chapel where generations of Habsburgs had sought divine guidance. The young emperor would kneel before the altar, his breath visible in the cold air, offering silent petitions for wisdom and strength. The rituals of faith were not merely ceremonial for Franz Joseph. They formed the bedrock of his belief in the divine right of kings and the sacred nature of his imperial mission. After prayers, he would immerse himself in the endless stream of documents that flowed to the emperor's desk from every corner of the empire. Reports from governors, military dispatches, financial statements, and diplomatic correspondence created a paper landscape that mapped the complexities of ruling diverse peoples. Franz Joseph read each document with methodical care, his pen scratching notes in the margins, his signature appearing on decrees that would affect the daily lives of subjects he would never meet. The emperor's working style was marked by an almost obsessive attention to detail. Where his grandfather, Emperor Francis I, had relied heavily on his chief minister Metternich, Franz Joseph insisted on personal involvement in every significant decision. He would spend hours studying military maps, memorizing the names of officers and the disposition of troops, understanding that the loyalty of his army was the foundation upon which imperial power rested. In the summer of 1849, as the Hungarian rebellion entered its final phase, Franz Joseph made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his reign. Unable to suppress the revolt with Austrian forces alone, he accepted the offer of military assistance from Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. The sight of Russian soldiers marching through Hungarian villages to restore Habsburg rule was a bitter pill for the young emperor to swallow, but he justified it as necessary for the preservation of the empire his ancestors had built. The defeat of the Hungarian Revolution was swift and decisive. General Artur Garjay, who had led the Hungarian forces with remarkable skill, finally surrendered to the Russians at Vilagos in August 1849. The aftermath was marked by executions and imprisonments that would poison relations between Vienna and Budapest for decades to come. Franz Joseph, advised by his ministers that harsh punishment was necessary to prevent future revolts, signed the death warrants of 13 Hungarian generals, including the poet-soldier Lajos Batthyány. The executions at Arad became known as the Arad Martyrs, and their memory would be preserved in Hungarian hearts like sacred relics. Franz Joseph would later express private regret about the severity of the reprisals, but the damage to his reputation among the Hungarian people was irreversible. The young emperor learned a harsh lesson about the price of maintaining unity in a multinational empire. Sometimes the very actions taken to preserve the whole would alienate the parts. As the 1850s unfolded, Franz Joseph faced his first major test on the international stage. The Crimean War, which erupted in 1853 between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, presented the Austrian emperor with a diplomatic puzzle that would define his relationship with the great powers of Europe. The war began far from Austrian borders, in the disputed territories around the Black Sea, but its implications would ripple through the concert of European diplomacy, like stones thrown into still water. Tsar Nicholas I, who had come to Austria's aid in 1849, expected Franz Joseph to reciprocate when Britain and France entered the war on the side of the Ottomans. The Russian emperor sent envoys to Vienna with appeals that mixed diplomatic protocol with personal entreaty. They reminded the young Habsburg ruler of the Russian soldiers who had helped crush the Hungarian Revolution, of the bonds of Orthodox Christianity that linked the Romanov and Habsburg dynasties, of the shared conservative principles that had guided both empires through the revolutionary upheavals of the previous decade. But Franz Joseph, guided by the counsel of his foreign minister, Karl Ferdinand von Bohl, chose a path of armed neutrality that satisfied neither side. Austrian forces mobilized along the borders of Moldavia and Wallachia, the Ottoman principalities that Russia had occupied, creating a military presence that tacitly threatened Russian interests without explicitly supporting the Western allies. This delicate balancing act required constant diplomatic maneuvering, as Austrian representatives met with Russian, French, and British diplomats in the gilded salons of European capitals. The emperor's decision to remain neutral was driven by careful calculation rather than indecision. Austria's finances were still strained from the costs of suppressing the revolutions of 1848, and the empire could ill afford a major war. Moreover, Franz Joseph recognized that Austria's strategic interests lay in maintaining the balance of power in Europe rather than tilting decisively toward either camp. The Ottoman Empire, despite its Muslim faith, served as a buffer against Russian expansion in the Balkans, a region where Austrian and Russian interests inevitably clashed. The consequences of this neutrality would unfold gradually over the following years. The Tsar never forgave what he saw as Austrian ingratitude, and the relationship between Vienna and St. Petersburg, once characterized by conservative solidarity, cooled into mutual suspicion. When the Peace of Paris was signed in 1856, ending the Crimean War, Austria found itself isolated, having gained the enmity of Russia without securing the genuine friendship of Britain and France. Franz Joseph watched the diplomatic isolation of his empire with growing concern. The young emperor, who had ascended to the throne believing in the strength of legitimate monarchy and conservative alliance, now faced the reality that international relations were governed by interest rather than principle. The lesson was bitter but necessary. Austria would have to navigate European politics with greater skill and flexibility if it hoped to maintain its position as a great power amid the pressures of statecraft and the burden of imperial responsibility. Franz Joseph's personal life remained largely separate from his public duties. The emperor's daily routine was structured around his governmental obligations, but even the most dedicated ruler required moments of respite from the weight of decision-making. For Franz Joseph, these moments often came in the form of long walks through the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, where he could contemplate the challenges facing his empire while surrounded by the ordered beauty of Baroque landscaping. The question of marriage had been a subject of discussion among the court advisors and the emperor's mother, Archduchess Sophie. Since Franz Joseph's accession to the throne, a royal marriage was never merely a personal matter. It was a diplomatic instrument that could strengthen alliances, secure borders, or heal political wounds. The Habsburg dynasty had a long tradition of strategic marriages, summarized in the famous motto, Belligerant Ali. To Felix Austria nubi, let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry. Initially, consideration was given to various princesses from the German states, matches that would strengthen Austria's position within the German Confederation. The names of Prussian and Bavarian princesses were mentioned in diplomatic correspondence, their portraits studied by court officials who evaluated not only their beauty but their potential to bear healthy heirs to the Habsburg throne. However, fate would intervene in the form of an unexpected encounter that would change the course of Franz Joseph's personal life. In the summer of 1853, Franz Joseph traveled to the spa town of Bad Ischl, nestled in the Salzkammergut region of Upper Austria. The emperor had been suffering from stress-related ailments, and his physicians had recommended the restorative waters of the famous resort. Bad Ischl had long been a favorite retreat of the Habsburg family, its mountain air and thermal springs offering relief from the pressures of court life. The town's elegant villas and manicured gardens provided a setting where the rigid protocol of imperial life could be temporarily relaxed. It was here, in the relaxed atmosphere of a summer resort, that Franz Joseph first encountered Elisabeth of Bavaria, known within the family as Sisi. She was 15 years old, the daughter of Duke Maximilian in Bavaria, and she had come to Bad Ischl as part of an arranged meeting between Franz Joseph and her older sister, Helene. The meeting had been orchestrated by Archduchess Sophie A., who believed that Helene would make a suitable bride for her son. But the emperor's attention was immediately captured by the younger sister. Elisabeth possessed a natural beauty that was enhanced by her vivacious personality and her love of poetry and writing. Where Helene was serious and dutiful, Elisabeth was spirited and unconventional. She moved through the formal gardens of Bad Ischl with the grace of someone who felt more at home in the mountains than in palace corridors. Her long hair catching the summer light, her laughter carrying across the carefully maintained lawns. Franz Joseph, who had spent his adult life surrounded by the calculated behavior of court life, was enchanted by Elizabeth's genuine spontaneity. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of alpine scenery, with walks along mountain paths and conversations that revealed the girl's quick intelligence and romantic sensibilities. For the first time in his life, the emperor allowed personal feeling to override political calculation, and he announced his intention to marry Elizabeth rather than her sister. The engagement was announced to the court in August 1853, and the wedding was planned for April of the following year. The ceremony would take place in the Augustinian church in Vienna, the same church where Franz Joseph's parents had been married and where generations of Habsburgs had exchanged vows. The preparations involved months of planning, with court officials coordinating every detail from the bride's dress to the ceremonial processions that would mark the occasion, while Franz Joseph's personal life was marked by the joy of his engagement and marriage. His political responsibilities continued to present increasingly complex challenges. The Italian states, which had been restored to Austrian control after the revolutions of 1848, remained a source of persistent tension. The Kingdom of Lombardy-Venetia, directly administered by Austria, was particularly restless, with secret societies and nationalist movements working to undermine Habsburg authority. The Italian question was complicated by the involvement of foreign powers, particularly France and the emerging Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. Count Camillo di Cavour, the brilliant Prime Minister of Sardinia, had begun a careful campaign to unite the Italian states under Piedmontese leadership, a goal that necessarily involved expelling Austrian influence from the peninsula. Cavour's strategy was masterful in its subtlety, combining diplomatic maneuvering with careful military preparation. Franz Joseph found himself facing a challenge that went beyond mere military rebellion. The Italian independence movement drew its strength from the growing power of nationalism, an ideology that threatened the very foundations of the multinational Habsburg Empire. If the principle of national self-determination were to triumph in Italy, what would prevent similar movements from emerging among the Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, and other national groups within the Austrian domains? The emperor's response to the Italian challenge was shaped by his belief in the legitimacy of Habsburg rule and his determination to preserve the territorial integrity of the empire. Austrian forces in northern Italy were reinforced, and Field Marshal Radetzky, the aging hero of the 1848 campaigns, was retained in command despite his advanced years. The old general, now in his 80s, embodied the military traditions of the Habsburg army, but his tactics and strategic thinking belonged to an earlier era. The diplomatic situation became increasingly complicated as France, under Napoleon III, began to take a more active interest in Italian affairs. The French emperor, nephew of the great Napoleon, was driven by a combination of personal ambition and genuine sympathy for the Italian cause. His meetings with Cavour in the summer of 1858 resulted in the secret Treaty of Plomières, which committed France to support Sardinia in a war against Austria in exchange for territorial concessions in Savoy and Neustadt. Franz Joseph, through his intelligence services, learned of the growing cooperation between France and Sardinia, but he faced a difficult choice. A preemptive strike against Sardinia might provide military advantages, but it would also give France the excuse to enter the war as the protector of a smaller nation against Austrian aggression. On the other hand, waiting for the enemy to strike first might mean facing a war on unfavorable terms against a coalition of powers. The emperor's decision to mobilize Austrian forces along the Sardinian border in the spring of 1859 was intended as a deterrent, but it had the opposite effect. The mobilization provided Napoleon III with the justification he needed to honor his alliance with Sardinia, and by late April, French troops were crossing the Alps into northern Italy. The Second Italian War of Independence had begun, and Franz Joseph found himself facing the most serious military challenge of his reign. The war that followed would test every aspect of Austrian military capability. The battles of Magenta and Solferino, fought in the early summer of 1859, demonstrated both the bravery of Austrian soldiers and the limitations of their leadership and equipment. At Solferino, Franz Joseph personally took command of the Austrian forces, riding among his troops and exposing himself to enemy fire with the courage that had always characterized the Habsburg military tradition. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical superiority of the French forces and the strategic advantages enjoyed by the Franco-Sardinian alliance. The Austrian army, despite its discipline and traditions, was hampered by outdated equipment and conservative tactical thinking. The French, armed with rifled muskets and supported by superior artillery, inflicted devastating casualties on Austrian formations that still relied on the bayonet charges that had been effective in earlier wars. The sight of Austrian soldiers falling in neat ranks under the devastating fire of modern weapons was a traumatic experience for Franz Joseph. The emperor, who had grown up hearing tales of Austrian military glory in the Napoleonic Wars, now witnessed the human cost of his political decisions. The screams of wounded men, the smell of gunpowder, and the chaos of battle impressed themselves on his memory in ways that would influence his approach to warfare for the rest of his reign. The aftermath of Solferino brought Franz Joseph face to face with the limitations of Austrian power in the changing European landscape. The battle, fought on June 24, 1859, had been a tactical defeat that threatened to become a strategic disaster. Austrian forces, despite their brave resistance, had been forced to retreat, leaving the road to Vienna potentially open to French and Sardinian forces. The emperor, surveying the battlefield where thousands of his soldiers lay dead or wounded, understood that the war could not be won through military means alone. The decision to seek peace was made in the aftermath of Solferino, as Franz Joseph realized that continuing the war would only lead to greater losses without any prospect of victory. The French Emperor, Napoleon III, despite his military success, was also eager to end the conflict. The sight of the casualties at Solferino had affected him deeply, and he was beginning to understand that the war might escalate beyond his original intentions. The peace negotiations that followed were conducted in the Villa San Martino near Villafranca, a small town in the Veneto region. Franz Joseph and Napoleon III met personally to discuss the terms, a rare occurrence in 19th-century diplomacy that reflected the urgency both emperors felt to end the bloodshed. The Austrian emperor, though defeated, maintained his dignity. throughout the negotiations, accepting the loss of Lombardy, while insisting on the preservation of Austrian control over Veneto. The Peace of Villafranca, signed on July 11, 1859, marked a turning point in Franz Joseph's reign and in the history of the Habsburg Empire. The loss of Lombardy was not merely a territorial defeat. It represented the beginning of Austria's withdrawal from Italian affairs, and the first major crack in the empire's status as a great power. The financial cost of the war had been enormous, and the empire's prestige had suffered a blow from which it would never fully recover. For Franz Joseph, personally, the Italian defeat was a profound learning experience. The emperor, who had ascended to the throne believing in the invincibility of Habsburg power, now understood that the empire faced challenges that could not be overcome through traditional means. The rise of nationalism, the changing nature of warfare, and the shifting balance of power in Europe all demanded new approaches to governance and diplomacy. The emperor's response to these challenges was characteristically methodical. He initiated a series of military reforms designed to modernize the Austrian army, bringing in new equipment and revising tactical doctrine to reflect the lessons learned in Italy. The process was slow and often resisted by conservative elements within the military hierarchy. But Franz Joseph's personal involvement ensured that progress was made. More significantly, the defeat in Italy forced Franz Joseph to reconsider his approach to the nationalities question within the empire. The success of Italian nationalism had demonstrated the power of ethnic identity as a political force, and the emperor recognized that similar movements might emerge among other subject peoples. The challenge was to find a way to accommodate these aspirations while preserving the unity of the empire. The Hungarian question, which had been suppressed but not resolved since 1849, now demanded renewed attention. The Hungarian nobility, led by figures like Ferenc Deák, had been watching the Italian events with keen interest, seeing in them a possible model for their own aspirations. The emperor's advisors began to explore the possibility of some form of constitutional arrangement that might satisfy Hungarian demands while maintaining imperial unity. The early 1860s marked a period of constitutional experimentation within the Habsburg Empire as Franz Joseph grappled with the need to modernize his government while maintaining imperial authority. The emperor, who had ruled as an absolute monarch since his accession, now faced pressure to introduce representative institutions that would give his diverse subjects a voice in their own governance. The challenge was to create a system that would satisfy the demands of different national groups without undermining the unity of the empire. The October Diploma of 1860 represented Franz Joseph's first attempt at constitutional reform. The document, drafted by Interior Minister Egynor Galachowski, proposed a federal system that would grant significant autonomy to the various provinces of the empire, while preserving ultimate authority in the hands of the emperor. The plan called for the creation of provincial assemblies with powers over local affairs, while foreign policy, defense, and major financial decisions would remain under imperial control. The reception of the October Diploma was mixed at best. Hungarian leaders, while pleased by the recognition of their distinct status, felt that the proposed autonomy was insufficient. They demanded restoration of the historic Hungarian constitution and recognition of Hungary as a separate kingdom, in personal union with Austria. Czech leaders, on the other hand, feared that the emphasis on historical rights would leave them subordinated to German-speaking administrators. The complexity of the nationalities question within the empire was perhaps best illustrated by the situation in Bohemia, where Czech nationalism was emerging as a significant political force. The Czech lands had been part of the Habsburg dominions for centuries, but they possessed their own historical traditions and a developing sense of national identity. Leaders like František Palack, the great Czech historian, argued for recognition of Czech rights within a federal framework that would respect the equality of all national groups. Franz Joseph found himself navigating between competing demands that often seemed irreconcilable. The German-speaking liberals, who formed the backbone of the imperial bureaucracy, wanted a centralized constitutional system that would guarantee individual rights while maintaining German cultural predominance. The Hungarian nobility insisted on restoration of their historic privileges and autonomous institutions. The Slavic peoples demanded recognition of their national identities and protection against both German and Hungarian domination. The failure of the October Diploma to satisfy any of these groups led to its replacement by the February Patent of 1861, which established a more centralized system. The new constitution created an imperial council Reichsrat with representatives from all parts of the empire, but the distribution of seats favored the German-speaking provinces. The system was designed to create a German liberal majority that would support the government's modernization program while maintaining imperial unity. The Hungarian response to the February Patent was swift and decisive. The Hungarian Diet, meeting in Pest, refused to recognize the new constitution and demanded restoration of the laws of 1848. The confrontation escalated when Franz Joseph dissolved the Diet and began to govern Hungary through imperial commissioners. The situation created a constitutional crisis that threatened to tear the empire apart. As Hungarian passive resistance made effective government increasingly difficult, the emperor's personal involvement in the constitutional crisis was extensive. He met with Hungarian delegations, corresponded with political leaders, and sought to find a compromise that would preserve both imperial unity and Hungarian satisfaction. The process was complicated by the competing advice he received from his ministers, some of whom advocated a hard line against Hungarian demands, while others argued for substantial concessions. The constitutional experiment of the early 1860s ultimately failed to resolve the fundamental tensions within the empire, but it did serve to educate Franz Joseph about the complexity of governing a multinational state in an age of rising nationalism. The emperor learned that traditional autocratic methods were no longer sufficient to maintain stability, and that some form of power-sharing arrangement would be necessary to preserve the empire's unity. As Franz Joseph struggled with internal constitutional questions, external challenges continued to threaten the empire's position in European affairs. The emergence of Prussia as a rival for leadership within the German Confederation posed a particularly serious threat to Austrian interests. Under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, who became Prussian Prime Minister in 1862, Prussia began to pursue a policy of aggressive expansion that directly challenged Habsburg supremacy in German affairs. The Schleswig-Holstein question provided the spark that would ignite the broader conflict between Austria and Prussia. The duchies, ruled by the King of Denmark in personal union, had been a source of tension between Danish and German nationalism for decades. When the Danish king died in 1863 without a direct heir, the succession question became entangled with the broader issues of German unification and the balance of power in Central Europe. Franz Joseph, as the traditional leader of the German Confederation, felt obligated to defend German interests in the duchies. The Emperor's decision to join Prussia in a war against Denmark in 1864 was motivated by a desire to maintain Austrian leadership in German affairs and to prevent Prussia from gaining exclusive influence over the disputed territories. The war was brief and successful, with Danish forces quickly overwhelmed by the combined Austrian and Prussian armies. However, the victory over Denmark created new problems rather than resolving existing ones. The joint administration of the conquered duchies became a source of friction between Austria and Prussia, with each power seeking to maximize its own influence. Bismarck, with characteristic cunning, used the dispute to isolate Austria diplomatically and to prepare for a larger confrontation that would determine the future of German unification. The crisis escalated throughout 1865 as both Austria and Prussia mobilized their forces and sought allies for the coming conflict. Franz Joseph, despite his personal distaste for war, recognized that Austrian prestige and influence in German affairs were at stake. The Emperor spent long hours in consultation with his military advisors, studying maps and troop dispositions, preparing for a conflict that would test the reformed Austrian army against Prussia's modernized forces. The diplomatic preparations for war were as important as the military ones. Austria sought to maintain its traditional alliances with the smaller German states, while Prussia worked to isolate Vienna and to secure the neutrality of the major European powers. The Emperor's foreign minister, Count Leinsdorf, engaged in complex negotiations aimed at building a coalition against Prussian aggression. But Bismarck's diplomatic skill proved superior. The 7 Weeks' War, which began in June 1866, was a catastrophic defeat for Austria. The Battle of König, Graz, fought on July 3, 1866, saw the destruction of the main Austrian army and the opening of the road to Vienna. Franz Joseph, who had again taken personal command of his forces, narrowly escaped capture as his army disintegrated under the superior firepower of Prussian needle guns and artillery. The defeat at König, Graz, was more than a military disaster. It represented the end of Austrian leadership in German affairs and the beginning of Prussia's rise to dominance in Central Europe. The Emperor, surveying the battlefield where his soldiers lay dead in their thousands, understood that the old order in Europe was dying and that Austria would have to find a new role in the emerging balance of power. The Peace of Prague, signed on August 23, 1866, formally ended the war and confirmed Prussia's victory. Austria was excluded from the German Confederation, which was dissolved and replaced by the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. The financial indemnity imposed on Austria was relatively modest, reflecting Bismarck's desire to avoid creating a permanent enemy. But the political consequences were enormous. For Franz Joseph, the defeat in the 7 Weeks' War marked the end of his empire's status as a great power in the traditional sense. The Emperor, who had spent the first 18 years of his reign trying to maintain Austria's position in European affairs, now faced the reality that his empire would have to redefine its role and restructure its internal arrangements if it were to survive in the new European order. The lessons of Komagata were painful but necessary. The Emperor learned that military force alone could not preserve Austrian influence, and that the empire's survival depended on finding new sources of legitimacy and stability. The path forward would require fundamental changes in the structure of the empire changes that would transform the Habsburg monarchy into the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. As the summer of 1866 faded into autumn, Franz Joseph stood at the windows of Schönbrunn Palace, gazing out at the gardens where he had walked as a young emperor, full of confidence in his mission and his empire's destiny. The man who looked back at him from the reflection in the glass was older, marked by the weight of defeat and the burden of difficult decisions, but in his eyes burned the determination that would carry him through the great transformation that lay ahead, the creation of a new constitutional arrangement that would give his empire a second chance at greatness. The wind that rustled through the autumn leaves seemed to whisper of changes to come, of compromises to be made, and of a future that would be shaped not by the glorious victories of the past, but by the patient work of reconstruction and reform. Franz Joseph, standing in the gathering dusk, prepared himself for the next phase of his long reign, knowing that the greatest challenges and the most significant achievements still lay ahead. The imperial court of Austria had witnessed many marriages of convenience, diplomatic unions forged in the cold chambers of political necessity. Yet when the young emperor Franz Joseph first laid eyes upon his 16-year-old cousin Elisabeth of Bavaria at the spa town of Badench in August 1853, something stirred within the methodical ruler that transcended the calculated arrangements of empire. The moment would be remembered not for its grandeur, but for its simplicity. A young man, burdened already with the weight of crowns and kingdoms, finding in a spirited Bavarian duchess something his soul had never known. It was missing. Elizabeth, known to her family as Sisi, had accompanied her mother and older sister Helene to what was intended to be Helene's engagement to the emperor. The elaborate choreography of imperial matchmaking had been set in motion months before, with the Archduchess Sophie, Franz Joseph's formidable mother, orchestrating every detail. But destiny, as it often does, chose to rewrite the script. When Franz Joseph's eyes fell upon Elizabeth, with her chestnut hair catching the afternoon light and her eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect the alpine lakes of her homeland, careful plans of mothers and ministers dissolved like morning mist. The courtship unfolded with the intensity of an alpine storm. Franz Joseph, who had learned to measure his words in the council chambers, found himself writing letters that poured forth with uncharacteristic passion. "I love you sincerely," he wrote to Elizabeth, "and I beg you to return a little of this love." The man who commanded armies and governed millions became, in those tender moments, simply a young suitor hoping for the affection of a girl who seemed to embody everything his rigid world was not: free, wild, and beautifully unpredictable. Their engagement was announced with the tolling of cathedral bells across the empire, but within the intimate spaces of their correspondence, something far more profound was taking shape. Elizabeth, despite her youth, seemed to understand the magnitude of what lay before her. "The emperor has need of a wife," she wrote to her sister, "but Franz Joseph has need of love." It was a distinction that would define their relationship: the eternal tension between the public demands of empire and the private longings of the heart. The wedding took place on April 24, 1854, in the Augustinian church in Vienna, with all the splendor befitting an imperial ceremony. The bride wore a gown of white silk brocade, her waist so slender it seemed to defy the laws of nature, her beauty so radiant that even the most cynical courtiers found themselves moved to silence. Franz Joseph, resplendent in his military uniform, could barely contain his joy as he spoke his vows. The ceremony was a masterpiece of Habsburg pageantry. Yet those who looked closely could see in the emperor's eyes something that had never been there before, a contentment that went beyond duty, beyond crown, beyond empire. The early years of their marriage unfolded like a fairy tale set against the backdrop of European grandeur. Elizabeth brought to the Austrian court something it had never possessed, a sense of spontaneity and natural grace that softened the rigid protocols of imperial life. She rode horses with abandon through the forests of Schönbrunn, her laughter echoing through hallways that had grown too accustomed to whispered conversations and measured steps. Franz Joseph, who had never known a life without schedules and ceremonies, found himself stealing moments to watch his wife as she moved through their world like a breath of mountain air. Their first child, Sophie, was born in March 1855, filling the imperial couple with joy that seemed to expand the very walls of the Hofburg Palace. The emperor, who had learned to compartmentalize his emotions in the service of duty, found himself utterly transformed by fatherhood. He would spend hours in the nursery, his hands so accustomed to signing documents that shaped the fate of nations gentling as they cradled his daughter. Elizabeth, radiant in motherhood, seemed to have found her place in the complex machinery of empire, her natural warmth providing the human element that the Austrian court had so long lacked. But even in these golden days, shadows began to gather. The Archduchess Sophie, Franz Joseph's mother, had never quite approved of Elizabeth's unconventional ways. The young empress's love of freedom, her disdain for court protocol, and her tendency to speak her mind created tensions that rippled through the imperial household. Elizabeth, who had grown up in the informal atmosphere of Bavarian ducal life, found herself constrained by the suffocating etiquette of Vienna. Every gesture was analyzed, every word weighed, every moment scheduled according to traditions that seemed to stretch back to the medieval mists of Habsburg history. The couple's second child, Gisela, arrived in July 1856, bringing fresh joy to the imperial family. Yet even as Franz Joseph delighted in his growing family, the pressures of rule continued to mount. The empire was facing challenges on multiple fronts. Italian nationalism was stirring. Hungarian discontent was simmering, and the great powers of Europe were engaged in a deadly dance of diplomacy and warfare. The emperor found himself torn between his desire to be a devoted husband and father and his duty to the millions who looked to him for leadership. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was discovering that being Empress of Austria was far more complex than she had imagined. The constant scrutiny, the endless ceremonies, the weight of representing an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, all of it began to take its toll on her free spirit. She who had once roamed the Bavarian countryside with abandon, now found herself trapped in a golden cage of protocol and expectation. The very qualities that had captivated Franz Joseph, her naturalness, her independence, her refusal to be constrained now, brought her into conflict with the rigid demands of imperial life. The birth of their son, Rudolf, in August 1858, should have been the culmination of their happiness. Here was the heir to the throne, the future emperor who would carry on the Habsburg legacy. Franz Joseph held his son with trembling hands, seeing in the infant's face the continuation of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Yet even this moment of triumph was shadowed by the growing realization that his empire was changing, that the old certainties were being challenged by new forces that neither crown nor scepter could easily control. As the 1850s drew to a close, Franz Joseph found himself facing the most profound test of his reign, the challenge of balancing his roles as emperor and husband, as ruler of millions and father of three. The man who had ascended to the throne as an idealistic young monarch, now bore the weight of experience. Understanding that every decision rippled outward through the complex web of European politics, his love for Elizabeth remained constant, a beacon in the storms of state. Yet even that love could not shield them from the gathering clouds that would soon test their marriage, their family, and their empire in ways they could never have imagined. Transformation of Elizabeth from the radiant young bride to the melancholy empress of later years began gradually, like the slow turning of seasons in the high Alps. By 1860, the weight of imperial life had begun to press upon her spirit with relentless force. The woman who had once moved through the world with the grace of a dancer now found herself increasingly confined by the golden chains of protocol and expectation. Her beauty, which had once been a source of joy, became a burden as every aspect of her appearance was scrutinized, analyzed, and commented upon by a court that seemed to have nothing better to do than dissect the private life of their empress. Franz Joseph watched his wife's gradual withdrawal with growing concern. The man who could command armies and navigate the treacherous waters of European diplomacy found himself helpless before the mysterious melancholy that seemed to settle upon Elizabeth like a shadow. She began to retreat into herself, spending long hours in solitude, her once bright laughter becoming increasingly rare. The emperor, who had built his life around routine and duty, struggled to understand the artistic temperament that yearned for freedom and authenticity in a world built upon ceremony and pretense. The imperial couple's relationship began to show the strain of these pressures. Elizabeth, who had once delighted in surprising her husband with spontaneous gestures of affection, now seemed to exist in a world apart from his own. She developed an obsession with her appearance that bordered on the pathological, spending hours each day on elaborate beauty routines that seemed designed to maintain an impossible standard of perfection. Her famous hair, which fell to her ankles when unbound, became both her crown and her cross, requiring the ministrations of a personal hairdresser who was sworn to secrecy about the empress's increasingly eccentric demands. Franz Joseph, meanwhile, threw himself into the work of governing with renewed intensity. The empire was facing challenges that demanded his complete attention: the loss of Lombardy to the emerging Italian state, the growing demands for autonomy from Hungary, and the shifting balance of power in Europe following the Crimean War. Yet even as he grappled with these monumental issues, part of his mind remained focused on the woman who had once been his closest companion and was now becoming increasingly distant. The tragedy that would define Elizabeth's life began with what seemed like a routine family journey. In May 1857, the imperial family travelled to Hungary, where Franz Joseph hoped to strengthen ties with his restive Magyar subjects. The children, Sophie and Gazella, accompanied their parents on this diplomatic mission. Their presence intended to soften the imperial image and demonstrate the continuity of the Habsburg dynasty. But the journey that was meant to heal political wounds instead opened a wound in the imperial family that would never fully heal. Both children fell ill with diarrhea and fever, symptoms that in the 19th century could quickly turn fatal. Elizabeth, who had thrown herself into motherhood with the same intensity she had once brought to her morning rides, refused to leave her daughter's bedsides. Franz Joseph, torn between his duties as emperor and his anguish as a father, found himself helpless before the mysterious illness that seemed to be consuming his children. The best doctors in the empire were summoned, but medicine in 1857 had few weapons against the bacterial infections that could destroy young lives with terrifying speed. 2-year-old Sophie, The couple's firstborn and the light of Franz Joseph's eyes died on May 29, 1857. The emperor, who had faced battlefield reports and diplomatic crises with stoic composure, crumbled before the tiny coffin of his daughter. Elizabeth, who had always been prone to melancholy, fell into a grief so profound that those around her feared for her sanity. The death of Sophie marked the beginning of a transformation in the Empress that would affect not only her own life, but the entire trajectory of the Habsburg monarchy. The imperial couple's grief manifested in different ways. Franz Joseph, trained from childhood to suppress his emotions in service of duty, channeled his sorrow into his work. He became even more methodical, even more dedicated to the business of empire, as if the act of governing could somehow fill the void left by his daughter's death. Elizabeth, however, could not find such consolation in duty. Her grief became a living thing that consumed her thoughts and shaped her actions. She began to withdraw not only from court life, but from the very empire that had made her empress. The years following Sophie's death saw Elizabeth embark on a series of extended travels that would become legendary throughout Europe. She journeyed to Madeira, to Greece, to England, always seeking something that seemed to elude her grasp. These journeys, which the press romanticized as the wanderings of a beautiful and mysterious empress, were in reality the desperate flights of a woman trying to escape the suffocating weight of her own sorrow. Franz Joseph, who valued order and routine above all else, found himself married to a woman who seemed to exist in perpetual motion, always leaving, always searching, never quite finding what she sought. The emperor's love for his wife never wavered, but it began to take on a different character. Where once there had been the passionate devotion of newlyweds, there now developed a deeper, more complex emotion that was part love, part concern, and part resignation. He learned to accommodate Elizabeth's needs for freedom and travel, understanding that her absences were not rejections of him but necessary escapes from a life that had become unbearable. Their correspondence during these separations revealed a relationship that had evolved beyond the fairy tale romance of their early years into something more profound and more painful. Elizabeth's travels took her to the furthest corners of Europe and beyond. She rode horses across the Hungarian plains, sailed the Mediterranean in her private yacht, and walked the ancient paths of Greece with the intensity of a pilgrim seeking absolution. Each journey was both an escape and a search and escape from the suffocating protocols of Vienna and a search for the authentic self that seemed to have been lost in the transformation from Bavarian Duchess to Austrian Empress. Franz Joseph, anchored to Vienna by the demands of empire, could only watch from afar as his wife pursued her restless quest for peace. The tragedy of Sophie's death also marked the beginning of Elizabeth's transformation into a figure of almost mythical proportions. Her beauty, always remarkable, seemed to take on an otherworldly quality in her grief. The strict regimens she imposed upon herself, extreme diets, the punishing exercise routines, the obsessive attention to her appearance, her ethereal quality that captivated all who saw her. She became not just an empress, but a living symbol of romantic melancholy, a figure who embodied the contradictions of an age that was both supremely confident and deeply uncertain. As the 1860s progressed, Franz Joseph found himself ruling not only an empire, but also navigating the complex emotional landscape of a marriage that had been forever altered by loss. The man who had once believed that love could conquer all was learning that some wounds never fully heal, that some losses cannot be compensated by any amount of devotion or understanding. Yet through it all, his love for Elizabeth remained constant, a fixed star in the constellation of his life, even as her own trajectory carried her ever further from the conventional path of an Austrian empress. Paradoxically, as the imperial couple's personal life became increasingly complex, their empire entered what historians would later recognize as one of its most brilliant cultural periods. The Austro-Hungary of the 1860s and 1870s became a magnificent theatre of human achievement, where the arts flourished under the patronage of a monarchy that understood the power of cultural expression to unite diverse peoples under a common crown. Franz Joseph, despite his personal struggles, proved to be a ruler who recognized that empires are built not only on armies and bureaucracies, but on the dreams and aspirations of their people. Vienna, the imperial capital, transformed itself into a city that would become synonymous with elegance, sophistication, and artistic achievement. The Great Ringstrasse, conceived during the early years of Franz Joseph's reign, began to take shape as a monument to Habsburg grandeur and civic pride. The boulevard that encircled the old city walls became a showcase of architectural splendor, lined with magnificent buildings that housed the institutions of empire, the opera house, the parliament, the university, and the great museums that would preserve and display the cultural treasures of the monarchy. The emperor himself, though personally more inclined toward military matters than artistic pursuits, understood the importance of culture in maintaining the legitimacy and prestige of his rule. He became a patron of the arts, not out of personal passion, but out of imperial necessity, recognizing that the Habsburg dynasty's claim to greatness rested not only on its political achievements, but on its ability to foster the highest expressions of human creativity. Under his reign, Vienna became a magnet for talent from across Europe, drawing composers, writers, painters, and thinkers who would create works that would echo through the centuries. The musical life of the empire reached heights that seemed almost supernatural in their brilliance. Johannes Brahms, who had made Vienna his home, composed symphonies that captured both the grandeur and the melancholy of the age. The waltz, that most Viennese of musical forms, found its supreme expression in the compositions of the Strauss family, whose melodies became the soundtrack of imperial life. At the magnificent opera house, which opened in 1869, the works of Wagner and Verdi shared the stage with the traditional operettas that had made Vienna famous throughout Europe. Franz Joseph, though not naturally inclined toward music, understood its power to unite his diverse subjects. He attended premieres with the same sense of duty that he brought to military reviews, understanding that his presence at cultural events was not merely ceremonial but symbolic of the monarchy's commitment to the arts. The image of the emperor, in his box at the opera, his military bearing softened by the glow of the stage lights, became one of the defining visual symbols of the age. The literary renaissance that flourished under Franz Joseph's rule reflected the complex cultural dynamics of the multi-ethnic empire. Writers like Franz Grillparzer captured the particular melancholy of Austrian life, that sense of being caught between past and future that characterized the Habsburg experience. The empire's newspapers and magazines, despite the constraints of censorship, became forums for intellectual debate and cultural criticism that helped shape the European consciousness of the era. The visual arts also flourished under imperial patronage. The great museums of Vienna began to acquire collections that would rival those of any capital in Europe. The Kunsthistorisches Museum, conceived as a temple to human artistic achievement, became a symbol of the monarchy's commitment to preserving and celebrating the cultural heritage of humanity. Franz Joseph, who had little natural aesthetic sensibility, nonetheless understood the importance of these institutions in establishing Vienna's claim to cultural leadership. The architecture of the period reflected the confidence and ambition of the empire at its height. The buildings that rose along the Ringstrasse were not merely functional structures, but statements of imperial grandeur and civic pride. The Parliament building, with its classical columns and allegorical sculptures, proclaimed the monarchy's commitment to constitutional government. The university, with its Gothic revival spires, announced Vienna's position as a center of learning and scientific research. The scientific and intellectual life of the empire also reached new heights during this period. The University of Vienna became one of Europe's leading centers of research and scholarship, attracting students and faculty from across the continent. The work of scientists like Gregor Mendel, whose experiments with pea plants laid the foundation for modern genetics, demonstrated that the Habsburg Empire was not merely preserving past achievements, but creating new knowledge that would benefit all humanity. The coffeehouses of Vienna became legendary as centers of intellectual discourse and cultural exchange. In these establishments, which combined the functions of library, club, and salon, writers, artists, politicians, and businessmen gathered to debate the issues of the day. Franz Joseph, though he never frequented these establishments personally, understood their importance in maintaining the intellectual vitality of his capital. The coffeehouse culture became one of Vienna's most distinctive contributions to European civilization. The fashion and social life of the imperial court also reached new levels of sophistication during this period. Elizabeth, despite her personal struggles, became a style icon whose influence extended far beyond the borders of the empire. Her legendary beauty and her distinctive fashion sense made her one of the most photographed and admired women in Europe. The court ceremonies and social seasons of Vienna became events of international significance, drawing visitors from across the continent who came to witness the spectacle of Habsburg grandeur. The economic prosperity that accompanied this cultural flowering was not accidental. Franz Joseph's policies of modernization and development had created the conditions for unprecedented growth and innovation. The empire's diverse regions, each with their own cultural traditions and economic strengths, contributed to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Hungarian plains provided grain, the Bohemian lands contributed industrial products, and the Alpine regions offered their unique crafts and traditions. The transportation revolution that connected the empire's far-flung territories also facilitated cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The railways that carried goods and passengers also carried ideas, artistic influences, and cultural innovations. A composer in Prague could premiere a work in Vienna within days of its completion, while a painter in Budapest could exhibit in the salons of the capital without the journey taking weeks of dangerous travel. The press, despite the limitations imposed by censorship, played a crucial role in disseminating cultural information throughout the empire. Newspapers and magazines carried reviews of artistic events, reproductions of visual artworks, and discussions of literary and musical developments. This cultural journalism helped create a shared imperial consciousness that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Franz Joseph's own role in this cultural renaissance was complex and often understated. While he was not himself an artist or intellectual, his steady leadership and commitment to modernization created the conditions in which culture could flourish. His personal example of duty and dedication inspired others to strive for excellence in their own fields. The emperor, who had ascended to the throne as a young man burdened by revolution and war, had created an empire that would be remembered as much for its cultural achievements as for its political accomplishments. The imperial family's patronage of the arts extended beyond mere financial support to active participation in cultural life. Although Elizabeth's travels often took her away from Vienna, when she was present at court, she brought to official functions a grace and natural dignity that enhanced the prestige of every artistic event she attended. Her presence at an opera premiere or gallery opening was not merely ceremonial but genuinely supportive of the artists and their work. The cultural golden age of Franz Joseph's reign was not without its complexities and contradictions. The same empire that produced sublime music and literature also struggled with ethnic tensions and social inequality. The glittering world of the opera and the coffee house coexisted with the harsh realities of industrial labor and rural poverty. Yet it was perhaps these very contradictions that gave the culture of the period its particular depth and resonance, creating art that spoke to both the grandeur and the tragedy of the human condition. As the 1870s progressed, the cultural achievements of the empire began to take on a quality of almost desperate brilliance, as if the artists and intellectuals sensed that they were living in a moment that could not last forever. The waltz melodies that filled the ballrooms of Vienna carried within them a note of melancholy that seemed to anticipate the end of an era. The architectural monuments that rose along the Ringstraße were built with a grandeur that suggested their creators understood they were constructing not just buildings but monuments to a way of life that was already beginning to pass away. The years that followed the new century's dawn brought with them an atmosphere of subtle but persistent unease, like the distant rumble of thunder on an otherwise peaceful evening. Franz Joseph, now well into his 70s, continued his methodical routine with the same disciplined precision that had marked his entire reign. Yet those who knew him best could discern a heaviness in his bearing that spoke of accumulated sorrows and mounting concerns. The empire he had spent 6 decades governing was transforming beneath his feet, shaped by forces that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. The nationalism that had once been merely a troublesome whisper in distant provinces had evolved into a chorus of increasingly urgent demands. In the Hungarian half of the dual monarchy, Magyar politicians pushed for greater autonomy, while in the Austrian territories, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and Slovenes each pressed their own claims for recognition and self-determination. Within the Hofburg Palace, the emperor's daily schedule remained as rigid as ever. He rose at 4 a.m, as he had for decades, beginning his day with prayer before turning to the endless stream of documents that required his attention. His meals were simple, his dress unchanged from the military uniform that had become his second skin. Yet those who served him noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he signed papers, how his once sharp eyes seemed to strain in the lamplight, how the burdens of state appeared to weigh more heavily upon shoulders that had borne them for so long. The international situation that greeted the 20th century was increasingly complex and precarious. The network of alliances that had once provided stability now seemed to create as many tensions as they resolved. The Triple Alliance, binding Austria-Hungary to Germany and Italy, was balanced by the emerging Triple Entente between France, Russia, and Britain. Each diplomatic crisis, and there were many, carried the potential to ignite a broader conflagration that would engulf all of Europe. Franz Joseph's relationship with his nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had evolved into something approaching mutual respect, though it remained tinged with the fundamental differences in their worldviews. The Archduke, 24 years younger than his uncle, brought to his role as heir apparent a different perspective on the empire's future. where Franz Joseph saw the necessity of maintaining traditional structures and gradual reform, Franz Ferdinand envisioned more radical changes that might address the growing nationalist tensions. The heir's marriage to Sophie Chotek, now elevated to the Duchess of Hohenberg, had been a source of ongoing complexity within the imperial family, while Franz Joseph had ultimately given his consent to the union. The morganatic nature of the marriage meant that Sophie could never become empress, and their children would be excluded from the succession. This arrangement, while legally necessary, under Habsburg law, created a constant undercurrent of tension and highlighted the rigid protocols that governed imperial life in the realm of military affairs. The dual monarchy faced mounting challenges that reflected the changing nature of warfare and international relations. The army, once a unifying force that transcended ethnic boundaries, increasingly found itself struggling with the competing loyalties of its diverse officer corps and enlisted men. Hungarian officers pressed for greater autonomy for their regiments, while Slavic soldiers sometimes questioned their allegiance to a Germanic dynasty. The naval expansion program that had begun in the 1890s continued to drain resources while providing questionable strategic benefits. The beautiful warships constructed in the Adriatic ports were impressive symbols of imperial power, but their practical value was limited by Austria-Hungary's geographic constraints and the dominance of the British Royal Navy in global maritime affairs. Yet the program continued, driven by prestige considerations and the influence of naval advocates who argued for the monarchy's need to project power beyond its landlocked heartland. Economic pressures also mounted during these years. The costs of maintaining the dual structure of government, with its duplicated bureaucracies and parallel institutions, placed significant strain on the imperial treasury. The Hungarian government's increasing reluctance to contribute its fair share to common expenses created recurring budget crises that required Franz Joseph's personal intervention to resolve. These fiscal challenges were compounded by the need to modernize the empire's infrastructure and military capabilities, while maintaining the extensive imperial establishment that was seen as essential to the monarchy's prestige. The cultural life of the empire continued to flourish despite these underlying tensions. Vienna remained a center of intellectual and artistic innovation, with the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud challenging traditional understanding of human behavior, while the musical compositions of Gustav Mahler and Richard Strauss pushed the boundaries of symphonic expression. The secession movement in art, led by figures like Gustav Klimt, reflected a broader rejection of traditional aesthetic conventions that paralleled the political questioning of established authority. In Prague, the Czech national revival reached new heights of cultural expression, with writers like Bezina, Nimkova, and Alois Jurasik creating works that celebrated Slavic identity and history. The construction of the National Theatre and the establishment of Czech language universities represented significant victories for those who sought to preserve and promote non-German cultures within the empire. Yet these same developments were viewed with concern by Austrian Germans who feared the erosion of their traditional dominance. Franz Joseph's personal life during these years was marked by increasing isolation and the accumulation of losses that seemed to strip away the human connections that had once provided comfort and meaning. The death of his brother Archduke Ludwig Victor in 1895 had removed another link to his youth, while the passing of old friends and advisors left him increasingly dependent on a shrinking circle of trusted confidants. His relationship with Katharina Schratt, which had provided emotional sustenance during the darkest period following Rudolf's death, continued to offer some solace, though it too was constrained by the rigid protocols of court life. Their correspondence, when it survived the careful censorship of imperial archivists, revealed a man capable of warmth and humor when freed from the burdens of his official role. Yet these moments of lightness were increasingly rare. The emperor's declining health became more apparent to those around him, though he continued to maintain his punishing schedule with characteristic determination. His physicians noted the symptoms of age, the gradual loss of hearing, the stiffening of joints, the occasional lapses in memory, but their patient remained stubbornly resistant to suggestions that he might reduce his workload or delegate more responsibilities to his heir. The first decade of the new century brought the empire into increasingly dangerous waters in the turbulent region that contemporaries had begun to call the powder keg of Europe. The Balkans, with their complex web of ethnic, religious, and national allegiances, presented challenges that seemed to grow more intractable with each passing year. For Franz Joseph, who had witnessed the empire's expansion into Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1878, the region represented both an opportunity to demonstrate Habsburg power and a source of persistent instability that threatened to engulf the entire monarchy. The annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908 marked a crucial turning point in the empire's Balkan policy and set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to catastrophe. The decision to formally incorporate these territories, which had been under Austrian administration since the Congress of Berlin, was driven by a combination of strategic considerations and domestic political pressures. Foreign Minister Alex von Ehrenthal, a skilled diplomat who had risen through the ranks of the imperial service, argued that formal annexation would provide greater security for the empire's southern borders and demonstrate Habsburg resolve to both allies and enemies. The international reaction to the annexation was immediate and hostile. Serbia, which had long harbored ambitions to unite all South Slavs under its rule, viewed the move as a direct challenge to its national aspirations. The Serbian government, backed by Russian promises of support, launched a campaign of diplomatic protest and internal agitation that would poison relations between Belgrade and Vienna for years to come. Within Bosnia itself, the decision provoked demonstrations and unrest, particularly among the Serb population, which saw the annexation as a betrayal of their hopes for eventual union with Serbia. Franz Joseph, who had given his consent to the annexation with characteristic deliberation, found himself facing a crisis that tested all his accumulated experience in international relations. The Russian government, still smarting from its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, initially threatened military intervention to protect its Slavic allies. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, offered diplomatic support, while Britain expressed concern about the precedent of unilateral territorial changes. Only Germany, Austria-Hungary's most important ally, provided unwavering support for the annexation, though even Kaiser Wilhelm II privately expressed concern about the wisdom of the decision. The crisis deepened when Turkey, which had retained nominal sovereignty over Bosnia and Herzegovina since the Congress of Berlin, demanded compensation for the loss of these territories. The Ottoman Empire, despite its own internal weakness, threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of power in the region unless its claims were recognized. The situation was further complicated by the Bulgarian Declaration of Independence, which had been timed to coincide with the annexation and added another layer of complexity to the Balkan puzzle. Through months of careful diplomacy and the implicit threat of German military support, Franz Joseph and his ministers managed to weather The immediate crisis. Turkey was eventually persuaded to accept financial compensation in exchange for recognizing the annexation, while Russia, faced with the prospect of a general European war for which it was unprepared, grudgingly accepted the fait accompli. Serbia, isolated and threatened with invasion if it continued its agitation, was forced to publicly recognize the annexation and promise to maintain good neighborly relations with Austria-Hungary. Yet the resolution of the immediate crisis did little to address the underlying tensions that had created it. If anything, the annexation served to intensify Serbian nationalism and strengthen the resolve of those who sought to challenge Habsburg rule in the South Slavic territories. Secret societies like the Black Hand, officially known as Unification or Death, began to proliferate, drawing their membership from military officers, intellectuals, and radical students who were committed to the creation of a greater Serbia that would include all South Slavic territories currently under foreign rule. The growth of these revolutionary organizations was facilitated by the porous nature of the border between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, which allowed for the constant flow of propaganda, weapons, and personnel. The Serbian government, while officially committed to maintaining peaceful relations with its larger neighbor, turned a blind eye to the activities of these groups and sometimes provided covert support for their operations. This policy of unofficial support for anti-Habsburg activities created a climate of permanent tension that made normal diplomatic relations virtually impossible. Within the annexed territories themselves, the situation remained volatile despite the apparent success of Austrian administration. The Habsburg authorities had invested heavily in economic development and infrastructure improvements, building roads, railways, and schools that brought tangible benefits to the population. Yet these material improvements did little to address the fundamental question of national identity that lay at the heart of the region's problems. The Catholic Croats generally welcomed Habsburg rule, seeing it as protection against Orthodox Serbian dominance, while the Muslim population, known as Bosniaks, found themselves in an awkward position between their religious identity and their political allegiances. The Orthodox Serbs, however, remained largely hostile to Austrian rule, viewing it as foreign occupation that prevented their natural union with Serbia. This division along religious and ethnic lines made it virtually impossible to create a unified provincial identity that could transcend traditional loyalties. Franz Joseph's personal involvement in Balkan affairs reflected his characteristic attention to detail and his deep concern for the welfare of all his subjects, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. He regularly received reports from the military governors of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and his correspondence reveals a genuine interest in the progress of development projects and the welfare of the local population. Yet he also understood that the political dimensions of the problem transcended administrative efficiency and economic development. The emperor's meetings with Balkan leaders and his correspondence with other European monarchs during this period reveal a man who understood the gravity of the situation but felt constrained by the competing demands of alliance obligations, domestic political pressures, and the need to maintain Habsburg prestige. His letters to Kaiser Wilhelm II express both gratitude for German support and concern about the long-term implications of the policies they were pursuing together. The military preparations that accompanied the annexation crisis established a pattern of heightened readiness that would characterize the empire's defense posture for the remainder of Franz Joseph's reign. The army was placed on alert, reserves were called up, and defensive positions were strengthened along the Serbian border. These measures, while necessary for security, also served to militarize the entire region and create an atmosphere of permanent crisis that made diplomatic solutions increasingly difficult to achieve. The financial costs of maintaining this enhanced military posture placed additional strain on the imperial treasury. At a time when the empire was already struggling with the expenses of modernization and the competing demands of its various territories, the Hungarian government's reluctance to contribute to what it saw as primarily Austrian concerns created recurring budget crises that required Franz Joseph's personal intervention to resolve. The international ramifications of the Balkan crisis extended far beyond the immediate region, affecting the broader balance of power in Europe and strengthening the alliance systems that would eventually contribute to the outbreak of general war. The German support for Austro-Hungary during the annexation crisis deepened the bonds between the two empires while simultaneously alarming Russia and France, who began to coordinate their responses to what they saw as Germanic expansionism. Britain, despite its traditional policy of maintaining the balance of power in Europe, found itself increasingly drawn into the Continental Alliance system as it became clear that the Kosoma naval building program posed a direct challenge to British maritime supremacy. The result was a hardening of alliance lines that made it increasingly difficult to resolve regional conflicts without involving the entire European state system. As the second decade of the 20th century dawned, Archduke Franz Ferdinand had evolved from a somewhat reluctant heir into a thoughtful and increasingly influential figure within the imperial hierarchy. His relationship with his uncle, while never warm, had developed into a working partnership based on mutual respect and shared concern for the empire's future. The Archduke's travel experiences, his military service, and his extensive reading had given him perspectives on imperial governance that often differed significantly from those of his aged uncle. Yet he approached his role with a seriousness that Franz Joseph had learned to appreciate. The heir's vision for the empire's future was both ambitious and controversial. Franz Ferdinand believed that the dual monarchy's survival depended on its ability to transform itself into a truly federal state that could accommodate the legitimate aspirations of all its constituent peoples. His concept of trialism, which would have created a third South Slavic component to balance the existing German-Austrian and Hungarian elements, represented a radical departure from traditional Habsburg policy. This vision was informed by Franz Ferdinand's deep study of the empire's ethnic composition and his recognition that the existing dualist structure was inherently unstable. The Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which had given the Hungarians extensive autonomy while maintaining German dominance in the Austrian half of the empire, had created a system that satisfied neither the other nationalities nor the long-term interests of the dynasty. The Archduke's proposed solution would have elevated the South Slavs to equal status with the Germans and Hungarians, creating a more balanced federal structure that might have diffused the nationalist tensions that threatened to tear the empire apart. The practical implications of this vision were staggering. Implementation would have required the complete restructuring of the empire's governmental institutions, the renegotiation of fundamental constitutional arrangements, and the overcoming of fierce resistance from both German and Hungarian elites who had no desire to share their privileged positions. The Hungarian government, in particular, viewed any expansion of Slavic influence as a direct threat to their hard-won autonomy, and would have fought such changes with all the political resources at their disposal. Franz Ferdinand's personal experiences had contributed significantly to the development of his political philosophy. His travels through the empire's various territories had exposed him to the legitimate grievances of the non-German and non-Hungarian populations, while his military service had given him insight into the challenges of maintaining unity in an ethnically diverse army. His marriage to Sophie Chotek, despite the controversy it had generated, had also provided him with a partner who shared his concerns about the empire's future and supported his reform agenda. The couple's 3 children, Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst, represented a new generation of Habsburgs, who would grow up in a world very different from that of their predecessors. Though excluded from the succession by the morganatic nature of their parents' marriage, they were being raised with an understanding of their heritage and their potential role in the empire's future that reflected their father's progressive views. Franz Ferdinand's approach to military affairs also differed significantly from traditional Habsburg practice. While he understood the importance of maintaining the empire's defensive capabilities, he was deeply concerned about the costs of the naval expansion program and the strategic assumptions that underlay it. His analysis of the empire's strategic position convinced him that Austria-Hungary's future lay not in competing with the great naval powers for global influence, but in developing the land-based forces necessary to defend the empire's extensive borders. The Archduke's involvement in military planning during this period reflected his growing influence within the imperial government. He regularly attended meetings of the War Council and maintained extensive correspondence with senior military officers throughout the empire. His reports to Franz Joseph often contained detailed assessments of military readiness and recommendations for improvements that revealed a sophisticated understanding of modern warfare and its requirements. One area where Franz Ferdinand's influence was particularly significant was in the development of relations with the empire's Slavic populations. Unlike many members of the Austrian elite, who viewed Slavic nationalism as simply a threat to be suppressed, the Archduke saw it as a force that could potentially be channeled in directions that would strengthen rather than weaken the empire. His concept of federalism was based on the recognition that the various peoples of the empire had legitimate aspirations that deserved respect and accommodation. This approach put him at odds with the policies being pursued by the imperial government. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the emphasis remained on administrative efficiency and economic development rather than political reform, Franz Ferdinand argued that the long-term stability of the region required addressing the fundamental question of national identity, not simply providing better roads and schools. His correspondence with the military governors of the region reveals a persistent concern about the underlying tensions that continued to simmer beneath the surface of apparent calm. The Archduke's views on foreign policy were similarly complex and often at variance with those of his uncle and the imperial government. While he understood the importance of the alliance with Germany, he was concerned about the growing military competition that was dividing Europe into hostile camps. His correspondence with foreign diplomats and his private writings reveal a man who hoped that Austria-Hungary might serve as a bridge between the competing alliance systems rather than simply as Germany's junior partner. Franz Ferdinand's relationship with Russia was particularly nuanced. While he recognized the fundamental incompatibility between Russian support for Pan-Slavism and Habsburg interests in the Balkans, he also understood that the two empires shared certain conservative values and faced similar challenges in governing ethnically diverse populations. His hope was that skilled diplomacy might find ways to manage these competing interests without resort to military conflict. The heir's analysis of the international situation was informed by his recognition that the empire's fundamental weakness lay not in its military capabilities, but in its internal divisions. A strong, unified Austria-Hungary could hold its own against any external threat. But an empire torn by nationalist conflicts would be vulnerable to any serious external pressure. This insight led him to place domestic reform at the center of his strategic thinking, arguing that political changes were essential to military security. Franz Ferdinand's cultural interests also reflected his broad vision for the empire's future. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, supporting institutions that promoted cultural exchange between the empire's various peoples. His personal collection of art and artifacts included works from all the major cultural traditions represented within the empire, reflecting his belief that diversity was a source of strength rather than weakness. The Archduke's involvement in educational policy was similarly progressive. He supported the expansion of educational opportunities for all the empire's peoples, including the establishment of universities that taught in languages other than German. His correspondence with educators and intellectuals throughout the empire reveals a man who understood that the empire's future depended on its ability to develop the talents of all its citizens, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. As the fateful year of 1914 approached, Franz Ferdinand's influence within the imperial government continued to grow. Franz Joseph, despite his advanced age, remained firmly in control of fundamental policy decisions, but he increasingly relied on his heir's advice on matters ranging from military affairs to foreign policy. The Archduke's regular meetings with government ministers and his extensive correspondence with officials throughout the empire established him as a central figure in the imperial administration. Yet even as his influence expanded, Franz Ferdinand remained acutely aware of the constraints that limited his ability to implement his vision for the empire's future. The resistance of entrenched interests, the complexity of the empire's constitutional arrangements, and the pressure of external events all served to limit the scope for fundamental reform. His private writings from this period reveal a man who understood the magnitude of the challenges facing the empire, but remained committed to finding solutions that would preserve the Habsburg legacy for future generations. The summer of 1914 arrived with deceptive tranquility. Its early weeks, marked by the familiar rhythms of imperial life that had characterized Franz Joseph's long reign. The emperor, now 84 years old, continued to maintain his rigorous schedule despite the increasing frailty that was apparent to those who served him most closely. His daily routine remained unchanged. The early morning prayers, the methodical review of state papers, the careful attention to ceremonial duties that he believed essential to maintaining the dignity and continuity of the monarchy. Yet beneath this surface calm, tensions that had been building for years were approaching a critical point. The international situation remained precarious, with the network of alliances that had once provided stability now creating dangerous rigidities that made diplomatic solutions increasingly difficult to achieve. The empire's internal challenges had not diminished, and the competing demands of its various peoples continued to strain the administrative and financial resources of the dual monarchy. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who had emerged as an increasingly influential figure within the imperial government, was preparing for what would prove to be his final official mission. The planned visit to Bosnia and Herzegovina, scheduled for late June, was intended to demonstrate Habsburg commitment to the region and to observe military maneuvers that would test the empire's defensive capabilities. The Archduke approached this assignment with his characteristic thoroughness, studying reports from the region and consulting with military advisors about the security arrangements that would be necessary. The decision to include Sophie in the visit had been made after considerable deliberation. While her morganatic status meant that she could not participate in all official functions, her presence would provide the Archduke with personal support and would demonstrate the stability of their marriage to the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The couple's 3 children would remain in Austria under the care of their tutors, a decision that would later take on tragic significance. The security concerns surrounding the visit were substantial but not unprecedented. The imperial government was well aware of the continuing tensions in the region and the activities of various nationalist organizations that opposed Habsburg rule. The military authorities had prepared extensive security measures, including the deployment of additional troops and the careful screening of all individuals who would come into contact with the Archduke and his wife. Yet the very nature of the mission required that Franz Ferdinand appear accessible to the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The purpose of the visit was to demonstrate imperial concern for the region and its inhabitants, an objective that would be defeated if the Archduke remained isolated behind impenetrable security barriers. The balance between security and accessibility would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. The political climate in Bosnia and Herzegovina during this period was characterized by a complex mixture of progress and underlying tension. The Habsburg administration had continued to invest in economic development and infrastructure improvement, with tangible results that had improved living standards for many inhabitants. New schools, hospitals, and transportation facilities demonstrated the empire's commitment to the region, while the careful attention to religious and cultural sensitivities had helped to maintain relative peace. However, the fundamental question of national identity remained unresolved. The Serbian population, in particular, continued to harbor aspirations for union with Serbia, and these sentiments were regularly reinforced by propaganda from Belgrade and by the activities of various secret societies that operated across the porous border between the 2 territories. The Black Hand organization, with its network of cells throughout the region, represented a particular threat to Habsburg authority, though the extent of its activities was not fully understood by the imperial authorities. Franz Joseph's personal involvement in the planning for the visit reflected his continuing attention to detail and his concern for his nephew's welfare. Despite their sometimes strained relationship, the emperor valued Franz Ferdinand's contributions to the imperial government and recognized the importance of his role as heir to the throne. The correspondence between uncle and nephew during this period reveals a mutual respect and shared concern for the empire's future, even as they sometimes disagreed on matters of policy. The international context of the visit was also significant. The great powers of Europe were engaged in an increasingly dangerous competition for influence and advantage, with each crisis in the Balkans carrying the potential to escalate into a broader conflict. The alliance systems that had emerged over the previous decades meant that any significant disturbance in the region would likely involve multiple powers, making diplomatic resolution increasingly difficult. Russia's continued support for Serbian nationalism posed a particular challenge to Habsburg interests in the region. While the Russian government officially maintained correct diplomatic relations with Austria-Hungary, its unofficial support for pan-Slavic movements created a constant source of tension that made normal regional development virtually impossible. The Russian press regularly denounced Habsburg policies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, while Russian money and weapons found their way to various anti-Austrian organizations. Germany's unwavering support for Austria-Hungary provided essential backing for Habsburg policies, but it also created obligations that limited the empire's diplomatic flexibility. The close coordination between Berlin and Vienna while necessary for maintaining the balance of power, also meant that any crisis involving Austria-Hungary would likely involve Germany as well, with potentially catastrophic consequences for European peace. The French and British governments, while not directly involved in Balkan affairs, were increasingly concerned about the potential for regional conflicts to escalate into general war. Their alliance with Russia meant that they could not remain neutral if Russian interests were threatened, while their growing concern about German power made them suspicious of any Habsburg actions that might strengthen the Germanic position. In Europe, as the date of the visit approached, Franz Ferdinand continued his careful preparations, reviewing security arrangements and studying the political situation in the region. His correspondence with local officials reveals a man who understood the challenges he would face but remained committed to fulfilling his duties as heir to the throne. The Archduke's final letters to his children, written just before his departure, express his love for them and his hope that they would grow up to serve the empire with honor and distinction. The journey to Bosnia began on June 23, 1914, with the imperial train carrying the Archduke and his wife south through the familiar landscapes of the empire. The route took them through regions that had been shaped by centuries of Habsburg rule, past cities and towns that bore witness to the complex history of Central Europe. For Franz Ferdinand, who had traveled extensively throughout the empire, the journey offered an opportunity to observe the changes that had occurred during his lifetime and to reflect on the challenges that lay ahead. The couple's arrival in Sarajevo on the morning of June 28th was marked by the careful ceremony that characterized all imperial visits. The city had been decorated for the occasion, with Habsburg flags and portraits of the emperor displayed throughout the streets. The local officials who greeted the Archduke and his wife had prepared an elaborate program of events designed to demonstrate the loyalty of the population and the success of Habsburg administration in the region. Yet even as the official ceremonies proceeded according to plan, the forces that would soon shatter the peace of Europe were already in motion. The young conspirators who had been recruited by the Black Hand organization had taken their positions along the route that the Archduke's motorcade would follow. Their weapons, supplied by Serbian military intelligence, were concealed beneath their clothes, while their determination to strike a blow for Serbian nationalism had been reinforced by months of preparation and indoctrination. The first attempt on the Archduke's life occurred as the motorcade traveled along the Apel Quay toward the city hall. A bomb thrown by Nedeljko Vabranovia exploded beneath the following car, wounding several officers but leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie unharmed. The Archduke's calm response to this attack, his insistence on continuing with the planned program, and his concern for the injured officers demonstrated the personal courage that had marked his entire career. The decision to alter the route for the return journey, made in response to the morning's attack, created the circumstances that would prove fatal. The confusion among the drivers about the changed plans resulted in a wrong turn that brought the Archduke's car directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators who had been positioned along the original route. The young Bosnian Serb, presented with an unexpected opportunity, fired 2 shots that mortally wounded both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. The Archduke's final words, expressing his concern for his wife and his hope that they would survive their wounds, reflected the love and devotion that had characterized their marriage despite the obstacles they had faced. Sophie's death, coming within minutes of her husband's, ended a partnership that had been built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the empire's future. Their 3 children, now orphaned, would grow up in a world transformed by the consequences of that morning's events. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was characterized by confusion and disbelief. The local authorities, who had been responsible for the security arrangements, struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. The news of the heir's death spread rapidly through the city and then throughout the empire, creating shock and grief that transcended ethnic and religious boundaries. Franz Joseph, who received the news at his summer residence in Bad Ischl, responded with the stoic dignity that had characterized his entire reign. His private grief was intense. The loss of his nephew represented not only a personal tragedy, but also the destruction of carefully laid plans for the empire's future. Yet his public response was measured and controlled, reflecting his understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on maintaining stability and continuity in the face of crisis. The investigation that followed the assassination revealed the extent of the conspiracy and the involvement of Serbian military intelligence in planning and supporting the attack. The discovery of the weapon's origin and the conspirators' training in Serbia provided clear evidence of Belgrade's complicity in the crime, creating a diplomatic crisis that would test all of Franz Joseph's accumulated experience in international relations. The demands for justice that arose throughout the empire were intense and widespread. The assassination had struck at the very heart of the Habsburg system, killing not only the heir to the throne, but also his wife, who had been beloved by many for her dignity and grace despite the controversies surrounding her marriage. The public outrage that followed the crime created pressure for a strong response that would demonstrate the empire's resolve and deter future attacks. Yet Franz Joseph understood that the decisions made in the wake of the assassination would determine not only the fate of those responsible for the crime, but also the future of the empire itself. The international situation remained precarious, with the alliance systems that had emerged over the previous decades creating dangerous rigidities that made diplomatic solutions increasingly difficult to achieve. The challenge facing the aged emperor was to find a response that would satisfy the demands for justice while avoiding the general European war that seemed to threaten from every direction. The summer of 1914, which had begun with such deceptive tranquility, was now dominated by the consequences of those fatal shots in Sarajevo. The world that Franz Joseph had known and shaped through 6 decades of rule was about to be transformed by forces that even his vast experience could not control. The age of emperors and kings, of careful diplomacy and gradual change, was giving way to something new and terrible that would reshape not only the Habsburg Empire, but all of Europe. As the summer days passed and the crisis deepened, Franz Joseph found himself facing the most difficult decisions of his long reign. The weight of history pressed upon him with unprecedented force, as he struggled to find a path that would preserve the empire he had served so faithfully while honoring the memory of his nephew, and the demands of justice that echoed throughout. His domain stopped the shadows that had been lengthening for years, now seemed to be approaching their ultimate darkness, and even the emperor's vast experience and accumulated wisdom seemed insufficient to illuminate the path ahead. The fate of the empire, and indeed of all Europe, would depend on the choices made in the days and weeks that followed. Choices that would echo through the generations and reshape the world that Franz Joseph had known. The reign that had begun with such promise in 1848, sustained by duty and shaped by tragedy, was entering its final and most challenging phase. The young emperor who had once believed that determination and devotion could overcome any obstacle now faced challenges that would test not only his personal resolve, but the very foundations of the world he had helped to create. The summer of 1914 would prove to be not only the end of an era, but the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in the history of Europe. In the quiet moments of that fateful summer, as Franz Joseph contemplated the magnitude of what had occurred, and the darkness that seemed to be approaching, he could not have imagined that the shots fired in Sarajevo would ultimately bring down not only his own empire, but the entire world of European monarchy that had shaped the continent for centuries. The age of empires was ending, and with it the world that had defined his entire life and reign. The war that had begun with such misplaced confidence in swift victory had become a grinding machine of death that consumed the flower of an entire generation. Franz Joseph, approaching his 86th year, found himself presiding over an empire that was slowly bleeding to death in the trenches of the Eastern Front, in the mountains of the Alps, and in the brutal campaigns against Serbia and Russia. The old emperor, who had survived so many crises throughout his long reign, now faced the ultimate test of his dynasty and his empire. Each morning brought telegrams from the front lines, each more sobering than the last. The casualties mounted with horrifying regularity. The Austro-Hungarian army, once the pride of the empire, was revealing itself to be a patchwork force held together more by tradition than by modern military efficiency. The empire's diverse nationalities, which had been sources of strength in peacetime, became sources of weakness in war. Czech soldiers deserted to the Russians. South Slavs showed little enthusiasm for fighting their Serbian cousins, and Hungarian units displayed more loyalty to Budapest than to Vienna. Franz Joseph received these reports in his study at Schönbrunn, the same room where he had worked for over 6 decades. The walls were lined with maps that showed the shrinking boundaries of his empire's effective control. Red pins marked the positions of his armies, while blue pins tracked the advance of enemy forces. The emperor studied these maps with the same methodical attention he had given to administrative documents throughout his reign, but now the papers on his desk spoke of retreat rather than expansion, of casualties rather than conquests. The economic strain of the war was becoming unbearable. The empire's finances, already stretched before the conflict, were now completely dependent on German support. Food shortages affected even the imperial court, and Franz Joseph himself ate the same rationed meals as his subjects. The emperor, who had always maintained the elaborate ceremonial of court life, now found himself presiding over a shadow of former imperial grandeur. The great receptions and state dinners that had once showcased the empire's power and wealth were replaced by somber meetings with generals and ministers, bearing increasingly desperate news. The weight of his years pressed upon Franz Joseph with increasing force as the war dragged on. He had ruled for 68 years, longer than any other monarch in European history save for Louis XIV of France. He had seen the rise and fall of Napoleon III, the unification of Germany and Italy, the transformation of Russia from absolute monarchy to revolutionary chaos. He had witnessed the birth of the modern world, with its railways and telegraphs, its nationalism and democracy, its industrial might and social upheaval. Yet for all his longevity, Franz Joseph remained in many ways a man of the old world. He still rose at dawn, still worked at his desk until late evening, still insisted on personally reviewing thousands of documents each month. His routine had become a kind of meditation, a way of imposing order on a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. The familiar rhythm of paperwork, audiences, and ceremonial duties provided a structure that helped him cope with the magnitude of the crisis engulfing his empire. The emperor's health, remarkably robust for so many years, began to show signs of serious decline. He suffered from a persistent cough that worsened during the cold Vienna winters. His appetite diminished, and he grew visibly thinner. Court physicians attended him with increasing frequency, but Franz Joseph dismissed their concerns with the same stoic demeanor he had displayed throughout his reign. He had work to do, and personal discomfort would not be permitted to interfere with his duties. Elizabeth's death in 1898 had marked the beginning of a profound personal isolation for Franz Joseph. Now, 18 years later, that isolation had deepened into something approaching complete solitude. His surviving relatives were few, and those who remained were often at odds with his policies or absent from Vienna. The emperor dined alone, walked alone through the gardens of Schönbrunn, and spent his evenings reading reports from the front lines in solitude. The loneliness was perhaps most acute during the long winter evenings when the emperor would sit in his study, a single lamp illuminating his work while shadows gathered in the corners of the room. The palace around him seemed to echo with the ghosts of better times, the laughter of children who had grown up and died, the music of balls that would never be held again, the conversations of ministers and generals who had passed into history. Franz Joseph had become a living monument to a vanishing world. The autumn of 1916 arrived with unusual beauty in Vienna. The leaves in the Schönbrunn gardens turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Franz Joseph, despite his failing health, continued to follow his daily routine with mechanical precision. He rose at dawn, reviewed his correspondence, granted audiences to ministers and military commanders, and worked late into the evening. It was as if he believed that maintaining his routine could somehow hold the empire together through sheer force of will. On November 21st, 1916, the emperor developed a high fever. Court physicians were summoned, but Franz Joseph insisted on continuing his work. He signed documents from his bed, received urgent reports from his ministers, and maintained his interest in the progress of the war. The fever worsened, and soon it became clear that the emperor was gravely ill. Word spread quietly through the court that the end might be near. The news reached the front lines with remarkable speed. Officers who had served under Franz Joseph for decades paused in their duties to contemplate a world without the emperor who had ruled for nearly 7 decades. In Vienna, crowds began to gather outside the palace gates, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief, uncertainty, and fear. The emperor who had been the one constant in their rapidly changing world was approaching his final hour. Franz Joseph's last days were marked by a profound sense of duty that never wavered. Even as his strength failed, he continued to ask about the war's progress, about the condition of his troops, about the welfare of his subjects. He expressed particular concern for the soldiers fighting in the mountains of the Italian front, where winter conditions were especially harsh. The emperor, who had sent so many young men to their deaths, now seemed haunted by their sacrifice. On the evening of November 21st, 1916, Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and Sovereign of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, died quietly. In his bed at Schönbrunn Palace, he was 86 years old and had ruled for 68 years. His last words, according to those present, were a simple question about the morning's dispatches from the front. Even in death, duty came first. The death of Franz Joseph marked the end of an era in European history. News of his passing spread across the continent within hours, carried by the same telegraph lines that had brought reports of battles and treaties. Throughout his long reign, in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, despite being enemies in the current war, ordered flags to be flown at half-mast in recognition of his fellow monarch's passing. In London, King George V declared a period of court mourning for the emperor who had been a familiar figure on the European stage for so many decades. The funeral of Franz Joseph was held at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, the same church where he had married Elizabeth nearly 60 years earlier. The ceremony was marked by the strange contrast between imperial grandeur and wartime austerity. The traditional Habsburg funeral procession made its way through streets lined with crowds, but the pomp was muted by the reality of war. Many of the European monarchs who would normally have attended such a ceremony were absent. Prevented by the conflict that had divided the continent, Franz Joseph's successor, his grandnephew Karl, inherited an empire that was already in its death throes. The new emperor, young and inexperienced, faced challenges that would have tested even the most capable ruler. The war was going badly, the economy was collapsing, and the empire's various nationalities were increasingly demanding independence. Karl would rule for less than 2 years before the empire finally disintegrated. In the wake of military defeat, the contrast between the old emperor and his successor was stark. Franz Joseph had ruled through the sheer force of tradition and personal dedication, maintaining the empire through his unwavering presence at the center of power. Karl, despite his good intentions, lacked both the authority and the institutional support necessary to hold the empire together. The very qualities that had made Franz Joseph an effective ruler, his conservatism, his respect for tradition, his resistance to change, had also made the empire increasingly obsolete in the modern world. Within 2 years of Franz Joseph's death, the Austro-Hungarian Empire would cease to exist. The defeat in World War I, combined with the rise of nationalism among the empire's various peoples, led to the creation of new nation-states carved from Habsburg territories. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and a reconstituted Poland emerged from the empire's dissolution, while Austria and Hungary became separate, much diminished republics. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not sudden, but rather a gradual process that had been building for decades. Franz Joseph's death removed the last unifying force that had held the empire's diverse territories together. Without the emperor's personal authority and his embodiment of Habsburg tradition, the centrifugal forces that had long plagued the empire became irresistible. The various nationalities of the empire, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and others, had developed their own national consciousness throughout the 19th century. Franz Joseph's policy of maintaining German and Hungarian dominance over these groups had created increasing resentment and demands for autonomy. The war had exacerbated these tensions as different national groups found themselves fighting for an empire that many no longer considered their own. The economic collapse that followed the war made the empire's dissolution inevitable. The complex economic relationships that had bound the various territories together were severed by the conflict. Industrial regions lost their markets, agricultural areas lost their customers, and the elaborate system of trade and communication that had sustained the empire for centuries broke down. The new nation-states that emerged from the empire's ruins often found themselves economically unviable, leading to decades of instability and conflict. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled in Austria for over 6 centuries, came to an end with the empire's dissolution. Karl, the last emperor, was forced into exile in 1919, and the new Austrian Republic prohibited the return of the Habsburg family. The palaces that had housed generations of emperors became museums, their grand halls and ornate chambers now serving as reminders of a vanished world of imperial power and aristocratic privilege. The cultural heritage of the empire proved more durable than its political structures. The great cities of Vienna, Prague, and Budapest retained their distinctive character, shaped by centuries of Habsburg rule. The architectural legacy of the empire, from the Baroque splendor of Schönbrunn Palace to the Gothic grandeur of St. Stephen's Cathedral, continued to define the visual identity of Central Europe. The empire's cultural achievements in music, literature, and art became part of the European patrimony, treasured by succeeding generations. In the years following the empire's collapse, Franz Joseph's reign took on an almost mythical quality. Those who had lived through the final decades of the empire began to remember the old emperor with increasing nostalgia. The chaos and instability that followed the war made the ordered world of Franz Joseph's reign seem like a golden age by comparison. The emperor, who had once been criticized for his conservatism, was now remembered as a figure of stability and continuity. The memory of Franz Joseph became particularly potent in Austria, where the small republic that emerged from the empire's ruins struggled to find its identity. Many Austrians looked back to the days of the empire with longing, remembering a time when Vienna was the capital of a great power rather than a provincial city. The emperor's image appeared on postcards and souvenirs, his portrait hung in cafes and restaurants, and his name was invoked by politicians seeking to connect with voters' sense of lost grandeur. Historians began to reassess Franz Joseph's reign, examining both its achievements and its failures with the benefit of hindsight. Some emphasized his role in modernizing the empire, pointing to the development of railways, the expansion of education, and the gradual liberalization of political life. Others focused on his failures, particularly his inability to resolve the nationalities problem and his rigid adherence to outdated political systems. The emperor's personal life also became the subject of increasing fascination. His marriage to Elizabeth, once the subject of court gossip, was transformed into a romantic legend. The tragic fate of his son Rudolf was seen as emblematic of the empire's own tragic destiny. Franz Joseph himself was portrayed as a lonely figure, devoted to duty but isolated from human warmth, a prisoner of his own imperial role. The literature and memoirs of the Habsburg period began to appear in the 1920s and 1930s, creating a rich body of work that romanticized the old empire. Writers like Stefan Zweig captured the atmosphere of pre-war Vienna, with its intellectual ferment and cultural sophistication. These works helped to create an image of the Habsburg era as a time of elegance and refinement, when Europe was still whole and the future seemed full of promise. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had been the spark that ignited World War I, but it was also the moment when the old European order began its final collapse. Franz Joseph's decision to declare war on Serbia, taken in grief and anger at his nephew's death, had unleashed forces that would ultimately destroy not only his own empire, but the entire world of European monarchy and aristocracy. The irony was not lost on later historians that Franz Joseph, who had spent his entire reign trying to preserve the old order, had inadvertently hastened its destruction. The war that was supposed to restore Austrian prestige and punish Serbian nationalism instead revealed the fundamental weaknesses of the Habsburg system. The empire's military proved inadequate, its economy unsustainable, and its political structure obsolete. Yet Franz Joseph's legacy extended far beyond the political and military failures of his final years. The empire he had ruled for nearly 7 decades had been a unique experiment in multi-ethnic governance, bringing together diverse peoples under a single crown. While this experiment ultimately failed, It had created a distinctive Central European culture that blended German, Hungarian, Slavic, and other traditions into something new and distinctive. The cities of the former empire retained their Habsburg character long after the monarchy's disappearance. Vienna's coffee houses continued to serve as centers of intellectual discussion. Prague's squares echoed with the memory of imperial ceremonies, and Budapest's Parliament building stood as a monument to the empire's constitutional evolution. The physical legacy of Habsburg rule provided a sense of continuity even as the political structures disappeared. The music of the Habsburg era, the waltzes of the Strauss family, the operas of Mozart and Beethoven, the symphonies of Brahms and Mahler became part of the universal language of European culture. These artistic achievements transcended national boundaries and political systems, creating a lasting monument to the cultural vitality of Franz Joseph's empire. The emperor, who had been tone-deaf to music, had nevertheless presided over one of the greatest musical flowerings in European history. Franz Joseph's 68-year reign was one of the longest in European history, spanning a period of unprecedented change and transformation. He had ascended to the throne in 1848, when Europe was still largely agricultural and feudal, and he died in 1916, when the continent was convulsed by the first mechanized war in human history. The world of his youth, with its horse-drawn carriages and handwritten dispatches, had given way to automobiles, telephones, and radio communication. Throughout this period of rapid change, Franz Joseph had remained remarkably consistent in his approach to governance. He had maintained the ceremonial and administrative traditions of the Habsburg court, insisted on personal involvement in the details of government, and resisted political reforms that might have undermined his authority. This consistency had been both a strength and a weakness, providing stability during times of crisis, but also preventing the empire from adapting to changing conditions. The emperor's personal character had shaped his reign in profound ways. His sense of duty, his disciplined work habits, and his devotion to his subjects had earned him widespread respect even among his critics. Yet his emotional reserve, his inability to delegate authority, and his resistance to change had also limited his effectiveness as a ruler. Franz Joseph had been a conscientious administrator rather than a visionary leader, managing the empire's affairs with meticulous attention to detail but without a clear sense of direction for the future. The tragedy of Franz Joseph's reign was that his greatest virtues, his sense of duty, his respect for tradition, his personal integrity, were precisely the qualities that made him unable to adapt to the changing world around him. The empire needed fundamental reform to survive in the modern age. But Franz Joseph's commitment to preserving the old order made such reform impossible. He had been the prisoner of his own virtues, trapped by his sense of duty into maintaining a system that was becoming increasingly obsolete. Yet Franz Joseph's failures should not obscure his genuine achievements. He had maintained the peace of Central Europe for most of his reign, providing stability and security for millions of his subjects. He had overseen the gradual modernization of the empire's economy and infrastructure, transforming Austro-Hungary into a major European power. He had managed to hold together an incredibly diverse empire through the force of his personal authority and his embodiment of Habsburg tradition. The ultimate judgment of Franz Joseph's reign must take into account both the world he inherited and the world he left behind. He had become emperor during the revolutionary upheavals of 1848, when the Habsburg monarchy seemed on the verge of collapse. The empire he inherited was backward, divided, and weakened by decades of military defeat and political crisis. The young emperor's first task had been simply to survive, to maintain the dynasty and preserve the empire from disintegration. In this fundamental task, Franz Joseph had largely succeeded. For nearly 7 decades, he had provided stable government for a multi-ethnic empire that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. He had modernized the empire's economy, built railways and telegraphs, established constitutional government, and created a functioning bureaucracy. The Austro-Hungary of 1916 was a far more modern and prosperous state than the Austria of 1848. Yet Franz Joseph's successes were ultimately overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. The rise of nationalism among the empire's various peoples, the growing power of Germany and Russia, the economic competition from more modern industrial states, and the changing nature of warfare all combined to make the Habsburg system obsolete. The emperor who had successfully managed 19th century challenges proved unable to cope with 20th century realities. The personal cost of Franz Joseph's long reign was enormous. He had sacrificed his private happiness, his family relationships, and his personal fulfillment to the demands of his imperial role. The loneliness that marked his later years was the inevitable result of a life devoted entirely to public duty. He had been a faithful servant of his empire, but the empire had exacted a terrible price for his service. The broader cost of Franz Joseph's reign was equally significant. His inability to resolve the nationalities' problem had created the conditions for World War I, which destroyed not only his own empire, but the entire European order. The war that began with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ultimately claimed millions of lives and reshaped the political map of Europe. The old emperor's final decision to go to war had consequences that extended far beyond the borders of his own empire. In the decades following Franz Joseph's death, his image underwent a remarkable transformation. The conservative emperor who had resisted change during his lifetime became a symbol of stability and continuity in an age of upheaval. The man who had been criticized for his rigidity was now remembered for his dedication and sense of duty. The monarch who had presided over the empire's decline was transformed into a figure of tragic grandeur. This transformation was particularly evident in Austria, where the small republic that emerged from the empire's ruins struggled with economic hardship and political instability. Many Austrians looked back to the days of the empire with nostalgia, remembering a time when their country had been a great power and Vienna had been one of Europe's leading cities. Franz Joseph became a symbol of this lost greatness, his image appearing on everything from coffee cups to tourist postcards. The emperor's personal story also captured the popular imagination. His marriage to Elizabeth, his tragic family life, his lonely final years, all of these elements contributed to a romantic legend that transcended historical accuracy. Franz Joseph became a figure of literature and film, his story retold and embellished by successive generations of writers and artists. The real man was gradually replaced by a mythical figure who embodied the glory and tragedy of the Habsburg era. Historians continued to debate Franz Joseph's legacy, with some emphasizing his achievements and others focusing on his failures. But for the general public, particularly in Austria and Hungary, he remained a beloved figure whose memory evoked a sense of lost grandeur and vanished stability. The emperor, who had been unable to adapt to change during his lifetime, became a symbol of permanence in an age of constant transformation. The physical reminders of Franz Joseph's reign remain scattered throughout Central Europe, the palaces where he had lived and worked, the public buildings constructed during his era, the monuments erected in his honor, all served as tangible links to the Habsburg past. Tourists from around the world visited these sites, drawn by the romance of imperial history and the appeal of a vanished world of ceremony and grandeur. The crown that Franz Joseph had worn for 68 years was more than a symbol of political power. It was the embodiment of a particular vision of European civilization. The Habsburg monarchy had represented the idea that diverse peoples could live together under a single sovereign, that different cultures could coexist within a unified political system, and that tradition and modernity could be reconciled through careful governance. This vision had ultimately failed, but its failure was not necessarily inevitable. Other multi-ethnic empires had survived longer than Austria-Hungary, and some had managed to transform themselves into modern federal states. The Habsburg system failed, partly because of external pressures, the rise of nationalism, the changing nature of warfare, the economic competition from more modern states, but also because of internal rigidities that prevented necessary reforms. Franz Joseph's personal responsibility for this failure was significant but not total. He had inherited a system that was already showing signs of strain, and he had faced challenges that would have tested any ruler. His conservative instincts and his resistance to change had certainly contributed to the empire's problems, but they had also provided stability during times of crisis. The emperor who was criticized for doing too little might have been equally criticized for doing too much. The tragedy of Franz Joseph's reign was that it ended in failure despite his best efforts. The emperor who had devoted his entire life to preserving the Habsburg monarchy had lived to see it weakened and would die just 2 years before its final collapse. The system he had served so faithfully had ultimately proved unable to adapt to the changing world, and his own dedication to duty had prevented him from making the radical changes that might have saved it. Yet, Franz Joseph's legacy extended beyond political success or failure. His example of duty and service, his commitment to his subjects, his personal integrity in the face of overwhelming challenges, these qualities transcended the specific circumstances of his reign and provided a model of leadership that retained its appeal even after the empire's collapse. The emperor who had failed to save his empire had succeeded in preserving something more valuable, the ideal of dedicated public service. In the end, Franz Joseph's reign represented both the culmination and the conclusion of a particular form of European governance. The Habsburg monarchy had been the last great multi-ethnic empire in Europe, the final attempt to maintain political unity across cultural and linguistic boundaries through the authority of a single sovereign. Its failure marked the end of an era in European history and the beginning of the age of nation-states. The lessons of Franz Joseph's reign remained relevant long after his death. The challenges he faced, governing diverse populations, managing economic change, adapting traditional institutions to modern conditions, were challenges that continued to confront political leaders throughout the 20th century. The emperor's successes and failures provided valuable insights into the difficulties of maintaining political unity in an age of increasing diversity and complexity. The cultural legacy of Franz Joseph's empire proved more durable than its political structures. The music, literature, and art produced during his reign became part of the permanent heritage of European civilization. The cities that had flourished under Habsburg rule retained their distinctive character, serving as living monuments to the empire's cultural achievements. The intellectual ferment of Finder Sequel Vienna, the architectural splendor of Prague, the literary flowering of Budapest, all testified to the creative vitality of the Habsburg era. Franz Joseph himself remained a figure of continuing fascination. his story retold by each generation according to its own needs and perspectives. Sometimes he was portrayed as a tragic hero, sometimes as a stubborn conservative, sometimes as a devoted servant of his people. The real Franz Joseph was probably all of these things and more, a complex figure who embodied both the strengths and the weaknesses of his age. The empire that Franz Joseph had ruled for nearly 7 decades was gone, but its memory persisted in the hearts and minds of those who had lived under its rule. The elderly men and women who had been young during the final years of the monarchy carried with them the memory of a different world, a world where the future had seemed secure and the old order had appeared permanent. Their stories, passed down to children and grandchildren, kept alive the memory of the Habsburg era long after its political structures had disappeared. The wind that blows across the hills of Austria carries with it the echo of old ceremonies, the whisper of forgotten prayers, the sigh of empire settling into memory. In the gardens of Schönbrunn, where Franz Joseph once walked in solitude, tourists now wander through paths that once knew the measured tread of an emperor's boots. The palace windows that once framed his silhouette now reflect only the changing sky, and the rooms where he labored over dispatches and treaties have fallen silent. Yet something lingers in these places, not the man himself, for he has passed into the realm of history, but the weight of his presence, the accumulated force of 68 years of dedicated service. The desk where he signed his final documents remains, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. The maps on the walls still show the boundaries of an empire that no longer exists, their colored lines marking territories that have been redrawn by war and revolution. In the crypts beneath the Capuchin Church in Vienna, where the Habsburgs have been laid to rest for centuries, Franz Joseph's tomb stands among those of his ancestors. The inscription is simple, befitting a man who valued duty above display. Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary. No lengthy catalogue of achievements, no poetic tribute to his reign, just the basic facts of his titles and the dates of his life. Yet visitors to the crypt pause before his sarcophagus, drawn by the gravity of what it represents. The empire he ruled has passed into legend, its glory and its tragedy alike transformed into the stuff of books and films, operas and paintings. The real Franz Joseph, the man who rose before dawn each day to serve his people, who endured personal loss with stoic resignation, who carried the weight of the crown until his dying breath, has become a figure of myth and memory. His story is told and retold, each generation finding in it something that speaks to their own experience of duty and sacrifice, of loyalty and loss. The Danube still flows through Vienna, carrying with it the waters of a dozen nations, just as it did when Franz Joseph stood on the palace balcony and surveyed his vast dominions. The river connects what politics has divided, flowing from the mountains of the Black Forest to the deltas of the Black Sea, binding together lands that once acknowledged a single sovereign. In its steady current, there is something of the patience and persistence that marked the old emperor's character. The bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral still toll the hours, their bronze voices carrying across the rooftops of Vienna, just as they did during the long decades of Franz Joseph's reign. They rang for his coronation, for his wedding, for the deaths of his son and his wife, and finally for his own funeral. Now they ring for other occasions, other ceremonies, other sorrows and celebrations. But in their sound there is an echo of continuity, a reminder that some things endure even as empires rise and fall. In the end, Franz Joseph's true monument is not any building or statue, but the memory of a life lived in service to something greater than himself. He was neither the greatest nor the wisest of rulers, but he was perhaps the most faithful to his duties, to his people, to the ideal of empire that he had inherited from his predecessors. His reign ended in failure, but the manner of his service remains an example of what it means to bear responsibility for others. The wind carries his story now, across the mountains and valleys of Central Europe, through the cities and villages, where his subjects once lived and worked and dreamed. Some remember him with affection, others with regret, still others with a mixture of both. But all who know his story understand that they have encountered something rare in the annals of power, a ruler who served rather than commanded, who gave rather than took, who remained true to his vision of duty even when that vision led to tragedy. The crown lies in a museum now, its gold and jewels no longer symbols of living power, but artifacts of a vanished age. Yet the weight of it remains, the moral weight of responsibility that Franz Joseph carried for 68 years. In the silence of the museum halls, visitors can almost feel the burden of that crown, can almost understand what it meant to wear it day after day, year after year, until death brought the only release. Perhaps that is Franz Joseph's greatest legacy, not the empire he failed to save, but the example he provided of what it means to serve. In an age of cynicism and self-interest, his story reminds us that there were once those who put duty before pleasure, service before self, the welfare of their people before their own comfort. Such men are rare in any age, and their memory deserves to be preserved long after their earthly kingdoms have turned to dust. The Austrian wind blows on, carrying with it the scent of mountain flowers and the sound of distant music. In its endless movement, there is something of the eternal, something that transcends the brief span of human life and the shorter span of political power. Franz Joseph is gone, his empire is gone, but the wind remembers, and in its memory the old emperor lives on, not as he was, but as he aspired to be, a faithful servant of his people, a guardian of their welfare, a keeper of their trust. Time flows like a river, carrying away the achievements and failures of each generation. But some things endure, the example of service, the ideal of duty, the quiet heroism of those who bear responsibility for others. In the story of Franz Joseph, these things find their expression. His reign may have ended in failure, but his example remains, as enduring as the mountains that surround his former capital, as constant as the stars that shine over the lands he once ruled. The story ends, but the echo lingers. In the silence that follows, there is both sadness and peace, sadness for what was lost, peace for what was preserved. The empire of Franz Joseph is gone, but its memory lives on in the hearts of those who value service over self, duty over desire, the common good over personal gain. In that memory, the old emperor has found his truest immortality, and so the wind carries his story across the centuries. A whisper of dedication in an age of doubt, a reminder that some things are worth preserving even when the world changes around them. The crown may gather dust, but the weight of service remains eternal, unchanging and true. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable reign of Emperor Franz Joseph. If these stories of history's most compelling figures have enriched your nights and deepened your understanding of our shared human story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Share these tales with others who find peace in the voices of the past, and let the wisdom of history continue to whisper its timeless lessons to new generations of listeners. Until we meet again in the realm of memory and dream, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be filled with the echoes of ages past.